At 11:00 p.m. on the 12th of November, 1961, in the pitch-black waters near Sandy Point in the Bahamas, and 11 year, old girl was awakened by the horrifying screams of her older brother. As she climbed onto the deck, the first thing she felt beneath her bare feet was a thick, sticky liquid that moments later she realized was blood. Just minutes afterward, her entire family vanished from this world, while a man standing on the deck jumped into the sea and disappeared into the darkness. But the most terrifying part was that for days afterward, he was still being praised as a heroic survivor. So, what really happened aboard the Bluebell that night? And why was the truth only revealed when a witness everyone believed to be dead suddenly reappeared? The answers to all of these questions will be revealed at the end of this story. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all their sugar with fine white sand. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Now back in November of 1961, Dr. Arthur Duperall was spending his days looking at eye charts and fitting prescription lenses in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Arthur was 41 years old, an optometrist, and the winter up in Wisconsin was already setting in, bringing heavy snow and freezing temperatures. Arthur had a very specific goal he had been working toward for years. He had set up a dedicated savings account at his local bank, and every time he got paid, he took a small portion and deposited it in there. He wanted to take his wife Jean and their 3 kids, one 4-year-old Brian, one 1-year-old Terry Jo, and 7-year-old Renee on a massive trip. He didn't want to just fly them to a resort. He wanted to charter an actual sailing vessel and navigate through the Bahamas for a week. So, by the second week of November, Arthur had finally saved enough. The family packed their bags into their car, pulled out of their snow-covered driveway in Green Bay, and drove all the way down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. When they arrived at the marina, Arthur finalized the lease on a ship called the Times Bluebell. The Times Bluebell Times was a 60-foot twin-masted sailing ketch. It had polished mahogany decks, heavy brass fittings, and enough cabin space below deck to comfortably sleep a large family. But Arthur was an optometrist, not a professional sailor. He needed a captain to pilot a vessel of this size. Through some local connections at the marina, he hired a man named Julian Harvey. Julian was 44 years old, and he had an incredibly impressive resume. He was a former Air Force pilot. He had flown B-24 heavy bombers during World War II, and he had flown fighter jets in the Korean War. He had a squared-off jaw, very rigid posture, and a habit of saying sir and ma'am to everyone he spoke to. Julian was married, and he brought his new wife, a 3-4-year-old former airline stewardess named Mary Dene, along for the trip to help with the cooking and the cleaning on the boat. On Wednesday, November 8th, the Times Bluebell Times cast off from the Fort Lauderdale port. They navigated through the deep channels out into the open Atlantic Ocean. Their first major stop was Bimini, a very small chain of islands located about 50 miles off the Florida coast. From there, they spent the next few days moving slowly through the Abaco Islands, dropping their heavy iron anchor near a place called Sandy Point. The daily routine on the boat was highly structured. Julian managed the heavy canvas sails and the rigging, while Arthur helped out where he could, pulling ropes and securing lines. Jean spent her afternoons sitting on the wooden deck reading paperback books. Brian, Terry Jo, and little Renee spent almost all their daylight hours in the water. Arthur had bought them brand new snorkeling gear back in Wisconsin, and the kids used it to dive down to the shallow reefs, pulling up large conch shells and bringing them back to the boat to dry in the sun. On Sunday, November 12th, the Times Bluebell Times was docked near Sandy Point. Arthur went ashore to a local administrative office and filled out some customs paperwork, indicating that they were going to start making their way back to Florida the next morning. That evening, Mary Dene cooked a large dinner for everyone in the small galley kitchen below deck. They had chicken cacciatore and a large salad. They ate together around a built-in wooden table in the main cabin. By 9:00 p.m., the sky was pitch black. Terry Jo was exhausted from swimming all day. She said goodnight to her parents, her brothers, and her sister, who were all still sitting up on the main deck talking. She climbed down the wooden ladder into a very small sleeping quarter located near the back of the hull. She climbed into her bunk, pulled a thin sheet over her shoulders, and immediately fell asleep. Hours later, Terry Jo woke up. The boat was pitching back and forth in the water. She heard her older brother, Brian, scream from somewhere above her. Then she heard the heavy, fast thumping of boots hitting the wooden floorboards right over her ceiling. She lay in her bunk for a moment, listening. The boat was completely quiet again. She threw off her sheet, walked out of her small room, and moved toward the main cabin area. She looked up the short wooden ladder that led to the deck. She climbed up the steps. As her head cleared the hatch, she looked around the deck. The wood was wet. She took a step forward and her bare foot pressed into a pool of thick liquid. In the moonlight, it looked black. She looked down at it, then looked up and saw her mother and her brother lying completely motionless on the deck near the starboard railing. Julian Harvey was standing a few feet away. He was breathing heavily. Terry Joe looked at him and asked, "What happened?" Julian turned his eyes wide and he yelled, "Get back down there!" Terry Joe turned around, climbed back down the ladder, and walked back to her small cabin. She climbed onto her mattress and sat with her knees pulled to her chest. A few minutes later, she noticed a smell. It was a sharp, metallic odor. It was ocean water. It was seeping in under her door. Within seconds, the water was pooling around the legs of her bed. It rose to her ankles. She realized the ship was taking on water fast. She stood up, waded through the flooded hallway, and climbed back up the ladder to the deck. The water was already rushing over the side rails. The Times, Bluebell Times, was leaning heavily to one side. Julian was standing near the edge of the boat. He had untied a small wooden dinghy and pushed it into the water. He was holding a thick rope attached to the front of the dinghy. He looked at Terry Joe, then tossed the rope toward her. But the rope slid right out of his hand and fell into the ocean. Julian stared at the rope, then leaped over the railing, plunging into the dark water and swimming toward the dinghy. Terry Joe was alone. The water was rising past her knees. She remembered seeing a small cork float tied to the top of the main cabin roof earlier in the trip. It was just a 2-foot by 5-foot rectangle of cork and wood, meant to be used as a basic life preserver. She waded over to it, her hands shaking, and managed to untie the knots holding it down. As she pulled the float free, the deck of the Times, Bluebell Times, groaned loudly and slid completely under the surface. Terry Joe held onto the edges of the cork float as the ocean swallowed the 60-foot ship beneath her. She was floating in the pitch-black open ocean. She was wearing only a light pink short-sleeved blouse and white slacks. She had no shoes, no hat, no water, and no food. The sun came up on Monday morning. The temperature on the water hit 85 degrees. The glare of the sun reflecting off the ocean surface was blinding. The salt spray dried on her skin, pulling it tight and baking into her pores. By Tuesday, her lips began to crack and bleed. Her tongue swelled in her mouth. She tried to pull her pink blouse up over her head to create a tiny canopy for her face. But the fabric was paper thin. Small fish began to gather in the shadow cast by her float. She could feel them bumping against her dangling legs. Further out, larger fins broke the surface of the water circling the area. By Wednesday, her third day on the water, the dehydration started taking a severe toll on her brain. She started seeing things. She saw a large desert island with a single palm tree rising out of the water, but when she blinked, it was just the crest of a wave. She saw a gray submarine surface right in front of her, but it vanished into the glare. While Terry Joe was drifting, something else was happening back toward the mainland. On Monday, the day after the Times, Bluebell Times went down, an oil tanker called the Times Gulf Lion Times spotted a wooden dinghy bobbing in the water. Inside the dinghy was Julian Harvey. He was sitting next to the lifeless body of 7-year old Rene Duperreau. The crew of the tanker pulled Julian aboard. Julian was completely calm. He gave the crew a very detailed, precise report. He said that around 1:00 p.m. on Sunday night, a sudden violent squall had hit the Times. Bluebell. He said the wind was so intense that it snapped the mainmast entirely. The heavy wooden mast crashed down, piercing the hull of the ship and severing the main gas line in the engine room. He said a fire immediately broke out. According to Julian, Arthur and the rest of the family were trapped in the flames below deck. He said he dove into the water, found the dinghy, and managed to pull little Renee from the water, but she had already drowned by the time he got to her. The Coast Guard listened to this report. They checked the meteorological records for that night, and there were indeed isolated squalls recorded in that specific area of the Bahamas. Julian was a highly decorated veteran. He spoke clearly and respectfully. The authorities believed his story. He returned to Miami, checked into a room at the Sandman Motel, and attended a formal Coast Guard hearing regarding the sinking. He was treated by the officials and the press as a tragic hero who had done everything he could to save his passengers. Then came Thursday morning. It was Terry Jo's 84th hour on the water. Her skin was severely blistered. She was slipping in and out of a coma. A crewman standing on the deck of a Greek freighter called the Times Captain Theo Times was looking out over the water through a pair of heavy binoculars. He saw a tiny speck bobbing in the waves. He lowered his binoculars, thinking it was just a piece of debris, maybe a dead pelican. But he raised them again and kept watching. A pale hand raised up from the speck. The freighter immediately changed its course. They pulled alongside the tiny cork float. The crew looked down and saw in 1 year, old girl with blonde hair, severely sunburned and entirely unresponsive. They lowered a stretcher down into the water, pulled her onto the float, and hoisted her up. Terry Jo whispered her name to the ship's doctor and then passed out. The crew of the Times Captain Theo Times immediately radioed the United States Coast Guard. Back in Miami, Julian Harvey was sitting in a chair at the Coast Guard hearing, answering routine questions about the maintenance of the Times Bluebell. A Coast Guard officer walked into the room holding a piece of paper. He approached the table, looked at Julian, and said, "Captain Harvey, we just received word. The girl, Terry Jo, she survived. She was just picked up by a freighter." Julian stared at the officer. The room went completely quiet. Julian swallowed hard and said, "Oh, that's wonderful." He stood up, asked the panel for a brief recess to gather himself, and walked out of the building. He got into his car, drove straight to the Sandman Motel, walked into his room, and locked the door. Based on physical evidence recovered from the wreck site insurance documents and witness statements, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe actually happened on the Times Bluebell. Julian Harvey was completely broke. He had massive debts and no savings. Just before the trip, he had taken out a $20,000 double indemnity life insurance policy on his new wife, Mary Dene. Late Sunday night, while the Duperall family was sleeping, Julian confronted Mary Dene on the main deck. He attacked her, intending to kill her and stage her death as an accident to collect the payout. But Dr. Arthur Duperall heard the struggle. He came up from his cabin and caught Julian in the act. Julian, realizing his plan was exposed, grabbed a heavy metal winch handle and a filleting knife. He killed Arthur on the deck. Knowing he could not leave any witnesses behind, Julian moved methodically through the boat. He found Jean, Brian, and Renee, and he killed all of them. He left Terry Jo asleep in her cabin, assuming she would simply drown when the ship went down. He went into the engine room, opened the sea valves, and intentionally flooded the hull to sink the Times, Bluebell Times, and hide the evidence. When police officers arrived at the Sandman Motel to question Julian about Terry Jo's rescue, they knocked on the door and got no answer. They forced the door open. They found Julian Harvey dead on the bathroom floor. He had taken his own life rather than face prosecution. Terry Jo spent 11 days in a hospital recovering from severe dehydration, muscle atrophy, and exposure. She eventually returned to Wisconsin to live with her aunt, the sole survivor of her family. A vast open ocean can swallow a person without a trace, leaving them to drift under the baking sun. But sometimes, a tomb doesn't require an endless horizon. Sometimes a person can vanish entirely without ever leaving the center of their own family home, sealed away in the dark while life goes on just inches away. In late November of 1963, 3-year-old Hilkka Saarinen stood in the kitchen of her home in the village of Krutila, Finland. Krutila was the kind of place where houses were spaced far apart, separated by dense birch forests and thick snowbanks that piled up against the window panes by mid-afternoon. Hilkka lived in a massive, historic wooden house that had been passed down through her husband's family for generations. The floorboards were made of thick, heavy timber that creaked underfoot, and the rooms were drafty, requiring constant upkeep to stay warm. Hilkka was a mother to 5 children. Her days started long before the sun came up. She would wake around 5:00 a.m., boil water on the stove, and prepare oats for the kids before they walked to school. She spent hours washing clothes by hand in freezing water and mending winter coats, and she did all of this while trying to navigate the very strict rules set by her husband, Pentti. Pentti was a man of routine. He worked, he came home, and he expected the house to be exactly the way he wanted it. He kept a close eye on the family finances, often counting the coins in the jar on the counter. He tracked the mileage on their vehicle. If Hilkka went to the market, Pentti knew exactly how long the drive should take, and if she was 10 minutes late, he would be sitting at the wooden dining table waiting for her when she walked in. He rarely raised his voice, but his reactions were absolute. One evening, one of the younger children accidentally knocked a ceramic cup off the table, shattering it on the floor. Penty simply stopped eating, placed his hands flat on the table, and stared at the child without blinking, until the child dropped to their knees to pick up the pieces. Hilka immediately stepped between them, sweeping up the shards herself so her husband wouldn't have to look at the mess. The centerpiece of this large, drafty kitchen was a massive, traditional Finnish masonry oven. This wasn't a standard metal appliance. It was a structure made of solid brick, easily 6 feet wide and just as deep, built directly into the home's foundation. It took up almost an entire wall, but it hadn't been used for baking in over a decade. It just sat there, a huge cold block of brick and iron right in the middle of the room where the family ate all their meals. By the time December rolled around, the temperature in Krutila had dropped significantly. The lakes had frozen over and the days were mostly dark. A few days before Christmas, Hilka's eldest son, a teenager named Seppo, walked home from school. He pushed open the heavy wooden front door and stepped into the entryway. He immediately noticed that the house was completely silent. Usually, at this time of day, his younger siblings would be running around and his mother would be at the stove preparing dinner. Seppo walked into the kitchen. Penty was sitting at the wooden table smoking a cigarette, looking out the frost-covered window. Seppo asked where his mother was. Penty took a drag of his cigarette, didn't look at his son and said, "She packed her bags. She left while I was sleeping." Seppo looked around the room. He walked back to the entryway. He looked at the hooks on the wall. Hilka's heavy winter coat, the one she wore every single day, was still hanging on its hook. Her thick winter boots were sitting on the floor mat. Seppo went back into the kitchen and told his father that her coat and boots were still here. Penty just shrugged. She must have taken the other ones. Over the next few days, the house remained quiet. Christmas came and went. There were no phone calls from Hilka. She didn't write any letters. Seppo contacted his grandparents, Hilka's parents, and they said they hadn't heard a word from her. Penty never picked up the phone to call the local police. When neighbors stopped by to ask where Hilka was, Penty would lean against the doorframe and tell them that she had run off with another man. And so the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years. Seppo and his 4 siblings grew up in that wooden house. And as they got older, they started noticing that Penty's behavior was changing, specifically regarding the kitchen. Penty instituted a new rule. Nobody was allowed to go near the massive brick oven. He yelled at the kids if they leaned against it. He moved the kitchen table further away from it. One night, when Seppo was around 16 years old, he woke up feeling thirsty. He walked out of his bedroom and headed down the dark hallway toward the kitchen. As he got closer, he heard a wet scraping sound. He stopped and peered around the corner. Penty was crouched in front of the old brick oven. He had a single flashlight resting on the floor, pointing at the heavy iron door of the oven. Penty had a trowel in his hand, a bucket of wet mortar, and a stack of heavy clay bricks. Seppo watched as his father meticulously applied the mortar and stacked the bricks completely, sealing the iron door of the oven shut. On another night, a few months later, Seppo woke up to a rhythmic sloshing sound. He crept down the hall again. The kitchen was pitch black, the lights turned completely off. But in the dark, Seppo could see the silhouette of his father on his hands and knees scrubbing the floorboards around the base of the oven with a heavy wire brush and bleach. When Seppo was old enough, he moved out of the historic wooden house. But he couldn't let go of what he had seen. He drove to the local police station in Kokemäki. He sat down at the front desk with an officer and explained everything. He talked about the coat left on the hook, the winter boots on the mat, the bricks mortared over the oven door in the middle of the night, and the bleaching of the floors in the dark. The officer listened, took some notes on a legal pad, and sighed. He told Seppo that his parents had a difficult marriage. He said adults walk out on their families every single day. Without a body, without a crime scene, and without any proof of violence, it wasn't a crime for a woman to leave her husband. The police refused to investigate. But Seppo didn't stop. Every year, he would write letters to the regional authorities. He would call the station. He requested meetings with different detectives, and every year he was turned away. This went on until 1972. It had been 12 years since Hilka walked out of the house. A new investigator had recently taken over the cold case files for the region. This investigator was reviewing old complaints and came across the thick stack of letters Seppo had written over the past decade. The investigator read through the details, specifically focusing on the fact that a man had bricked over an unused oven in the middle of the night right after his wife disappeared. The investigator went to a local judge and presented Seppo's letters. The judge granted a search warrant for the property. In the winter of 1972, a team of police officers pulled into the driveway of the wooden house in Krutila. Penty, now 12 years older, with graying hair and a thinner frame, opened the front door. The investigator handed him the search warrant. Penty didn't say a single word. He didn't ask what they were looking for. He just stepped aside and let them in. The officers walked straight into the kitchen. They stood in front of the massive brick oven. Penty had done a thorough job. The iron door was completely encased in solid masonry. The officers brought in heavy sledgehammers and steel crowbars. They took turns swinging the sledgehammers against the bricks. The sound of metal hitting masonry echoed through the house. Thick clouds of red dust filled the kitchen, settling on the counters and the floors. It took them over an hour just to break through the outer layer of bricks and pry the iron door open. When the door finally gave way, they shined their flashlights inside the cavity. It was empty. There was just soot and ash lining the walls. The officers looked at the investigator, ready to pack up their tools. But the investigator shook his head. He looked at the floor of the oven. Traditional Finnish masonry ovens are built with a deep foundation box beneath the baking surface, usually filled with several feet of sand. This sand acts as a thermal mass to absorb and slowly release heat into the house during the winter. The investigator pointed to the heavy fire bricks that made up the floor of the oven and told the men to break them. The officers raised their sledgehammers again and smashed through the baking floor. Beneath the broken fire bricks, they found tightly packed sand. They brought in shovels and started digging. The space was incredibly cramped. Only one officer could fit their upper body into the oven at a time, scooping out the sand and passing it back into buckets. They dug down 1 foot, then 2 feet. The sand was compressed and heavy. At about 3 feet deep, an officer drove his shovel downward and the metal blade hit something that didn't feel like packed earth. It was a dull thud. The officer stopped. He set the shovel aside and reached down into the hole with his bare hands. He brushed away the loose, dry sand. His fingers brushed against a piece of fabric. He kept digging around the edges, pulling up handfuls of dirt until he uncovered a human bone. The excavation slowed down. Forensics experts were called into the kitchen. They carefully removed the sand layer by layer. Because the foundation box was entirely encased in thick brick and completely insulated from the outside environment, there was zero moisture in the sand. The environment had acted like a perfect desiccation chamber. The body they pulled out of the sand had not decomposed. It had mummified. The skin was completely dried and pulled tight over the bones, preserved like leather. The officers lifted the mummified head and torso out of the hole and laid them on the kitchen floor. It was Hilkka Saarinen. She had been buried exactly 3 feet below the kitchen floor, right in the center of the room where her husband and children had eaten their meals every day for the last 12 years. Based on the forensic evidence recovered from the oven, the positioning of the body and the timeline established by the family here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened in December of 1960. It is late at night. The children are asleep in their beds. A heavy argument breaks out in the kitchen. The confrontation escalates quickly. A sudden, massive blow is struck to Hilkka's head. She collapses onto the wooden floorboards, completely unresponsive. The killer stands over her body. The ground outside is frozen solid under several feet of snow, making it impossible to dig a grave in the yard without drawing attention. The killer looks at the massive, unused brick oven taking up the wall. The killer drags her body across the floor. They use tools to pry up the heavy fire bricks lining the bottom of the oven. They spend hours scooping out 3 feet of dense thermal sand from the foundation box. Once the hole is deep enough, they lift Hilkka's body, fold her into the cramped space, and lower her down. They shovel the sand back in, packing it tightly over her to hide the smell. They replace the fire bricks, fitting them back together like a puzzle. Later, to ensure no one ever accidentally opens the door and disturbs the floorboards, the killer mixes mortar, carries heavy bricks into the kitchen, and permanently seals the iron door shut. Pentti Saarinen was immediately arrested and charged with murder. He was held in custody while the prosecutors built their case. The trial began, and the prosecution presented the mummified remains of Hilkka, along with the testimony of Seppo describing his father mortaring the oven in the dead of night. But the defense attorneys found a massive flaw in the case. The body had been buried in dry sand for 12 years. The mummification process had preserved the skin, but the internal organs and soft tissues were completely desiccated. When the forensic pathologists took the stand, they admitted under oath that because of the mummification, they could not definitively determine the exact medical cause of the fatal blow. They could see a fracture, but they could not mathematically prove whether the fracture was caused by a deliberate, premeditated strike with a weapon or if Hilka had been pushed, tripped, and accidentally hit her head on the heavy iron stove door. Under Finnish law at the time, premeditated murder had no statute of limitations. But the statute of limitations for accidental manslaughter was exactly 10 years. Because 12 years had passed since the night Hilka disappeared, and because the state could not physically prove that the death was a calculated murder rather than a spontaneous accident, the time limit to prosecute for manslaughter had expired 2 years prior. The judge looked at the evidence, looked at the law, and delivered the verdict. Pentti Saarinen was acquitted of all charges. He walked out of the courthouse a completely free man. He got into a car, drove back to the village of Krutila, and walked right back into the exact same wooden house. And he lived there alone until his death in 1986. From a death hidden away for 12 years in the dark center of a family home, to a tragedy that was displayed right out in the open, where the target was someone even more vulnerable. On a sweltering afternoon in June of 1960, the streets of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil were filled with the heavy scent of motor exhaust, roasted coffee beans, and salt water. The city was expanding rapidly, with towering concrete apartment blocks rising directly next to old Portuguese colonial buildings with peeling yellow paint. The sound of open-air streetcars rattling along steel tracks was constant, competing with the shouts of market vendors selling fresh fruit. In a middle-class residential district, a 4-year-old girl named Tania Maria, whom everyone in the neighborhood affectionately called Taninha, sat at a small wooden desk inside her nursery school. She was wearing a crisp, starched white uniform with a small blue fabric ribbon pinned to her collar, carefully coloring a line drawing with a box of imported wax crayons. The neighborhood was a place where families had lived for generations, where residents regularly left their front gates unlatched during the day, and children played on the concrete sidewalks without constant adult supervision. Taninha's father, Antonio Maria, was a highly successful merchant who operated a textile distribution warehouse near the city's central shipping docks. Antonio was known by his neighbors as a deeply disciplined, predictable man who walked the exact same route to his office every morning at precisely 7:30. He had a comfortable home, a stable marriage, and frequently spoke to his associates about his plans to expand his fabric inventory. But over the previous few months, those who worked closely with him began to notice small, unusual changes in his daily routine. So Antonio began leaving his warehouse during the middle of the day for hours at a time, leaving his assistants to manage the fabric deliveries. He spent a significant amount of his afternoon sitting alone in a small dim cafe located 3 blocks away from his main office, constantly checking his silver pocket watch and staring at the front door. He grew defensive whenever his staff asked where he had been hiding his personal ledger book inside a locked drawer. Back at the family home, his wife noticed that he had become distant, often sitting on the balcony late into the night, smoking cigarettes in absolute silence while staring out at the distant lights of the bay. Now, Taninha's mother usually walked the 4 short blocks from their home to the nursery school gate at exactly 4:00 p.m. to collect her daughter. The street outside the school was always chaotic at that hour, crowded with delivery trucks, parents, and vendors selling sweet roasted peanuts and cold sugarcane juice from wooden carts. On June 30th, the mother arrived at the iron gate right on time, moving through the crowd of waiting parents to the front entrance, where the young children were always lined up by the staff. She walked into the main hallway, expecting to see the bright blue ribbon in Taninha's hair, but the small wooden bench where her daughter usually sat was empty. The mother approached the head teacher, a senior staff member named Sister Maria, and asked if Taninha was still washing her hands in the restroom. Sister Maria looked down at her leather-bound logbook, then back up at the mother, her face turning completely rigid. She stated that Taninha had already been collected 20 minutes earlier by a woman who presented a signed authorization note and claimed to be the child's maternal aunt. The mother's breath caught, and she stated clearly that she was an only child, she did not have a sister, and absolutely no one else had permission to touch her daughter. Within minutes, the school office was filled with panic as the staff realized the little girl was entirely gone. By 5:00 p.m., a veteran homicide investigator named Detective Carlos Alberto arrived at the school with a team of 5 uniformed officers. They cordoned off the block and began a systematic interrogation of the school staff and the surrounding shopkeepers. Sister Maria described the woman who took Taninha as being approximately 38 years old, wearing a dark patterned cotton dress and large, thick sunglasses that completely obscured her face. The woman had spoken with a calm, highly educated voice, handing over a small slip of paper that contained a hurried cursive message authorizing the release signed with a name that carbon copied the mother's handwriting, but was entirely forged. Detective Alberto immediately focused the investigation on the theory of a financial kidnapping for ransom, given Antonio's prominent position in the local textile market. The police tech units set up a temporary monitoring station inside Antonio's living room, attaching heavy copper clamps to the telephone terminal in the basement to record any incoming calls. Alberto ordered his detectives to locate and investigate Antonio's primary business competitor, a merchant named Roberto Silva. Silva had recently lost a massive government contract to Antonio's firm, and 2 weeks prior he had been heard shouting threats at a local restaurant, vowing to make Antonio pay for ruining his business. Detectives located Roberto Silva at his shipping office near the harbor and brought him into the central precinct for questioning under the glare of a single overhead bulb. Silva admitted he harbored an intense hatred for Antonio and openly wanted to see his textile business fail, but he produced a verified alibi for the afternoon of the disappearance. At exactly 3:40 p.m., Silva had been sitting inside a state notary's office on the south side of the city, signing land deeds in the presence of 3 separate government officials. The police checked the official logs, verified the stamps, and were forced to eliminate Silva as a suspect. Next, detectives reviewed statements from a municipal street sweeper who worked the route directly outside the nursery school. The sweeper recalled seeing a thin man in a greasy leather jacket loitering near the playground fence for 3 consecutive days leading up to June 30th. The man had been pretending to throw breadcrumbs to the pigeons, but spent all his time staring through the wires at the children. Police launched a massive sweep of the surrounding alleyways, tracking the individual down to a damp basement room near the central train tracks, where they found him hiding beneath a pile of old blankets. The man was a local drifter with a lengthy record for petty vagrancy and shoplifting. When detectives searched his room, they found nothing but balls of twine pocket knives and stale bread. He was subjected to a rigorous 4-hour interrogation during which he wept continuously, explaining that he only watched the school playground because he was intensely lonely and missed his own young children who lived in a distant northern province. A local grocer checked his receipts and confirmed that at the exact moment Tanina was being led away from the school gate, the drifter was inside his grocery store arguing over the price of tobacco. 48 hours passed, and the black telephone on Antonio's living room table remained completely silent. No ransom notes were dropped through the front door slit, and no anonymous individuals called the warehouse to demand cash. Detective Alberto walked out onto the pavement outside the house and found Antonio sitting alone on the stone steps, staring blankly at his shoes. Alberto noticed that while the mother was inside the house being treated by a doctor for severe shock, Antonio was completely still. He looked physically ill, his skin gray and his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold a match, but he refused to look at the telephone. Alberto crouched down next to the father, looking closely at his face, and noticed that Antonio kept his right hand shoved deep inside his coat pocket, tightly gripping a small object. Alberto demanded that he empty his pockets onto the steps. Antonio slowly pulled his hand out, revealing a small brass key. Alberto recognized the key shape. It belonged to a private safe deposit box at a merchant bank downtown. The investigator realized that the father was hiding something critical from the police, and he ordered 2 uniformed officers to escort Antonio directly to his office desk to search his personal records. And so detectives spent 3 hours prying open the locked compartments of Antonio's heavy mahogany desk at the textile warehouse. Behind a false wooden panel beneath a stack of old shipping invoices, they discovered a small iron strongbox. When they used the brass key to open it, they didn't find stolen money or hidden business bonds. Instead, they found a thick bundle of handwritten letters wrapped tightly in a faded pink silk ribbon, along with several black and white portrait photographs of a woman who was definitely not his wife. The letters spanned a period of nearly 2 years, and Detective Alberto read through every page on the desk. The early notes were written in a neat, delicate hand, filled with intense expressions of devotion and detailing secret meetings in quiet hotels along the northern coast. But as the dates on the letters progressed into the spring of 1960, the tone of the writing changed completely. The script became massive, erratic, and pressed so violently into the paper that the metal pen nib had torn through the sheets. The final letter, dated exactly 7 days before Tanina vanished, contained a single, unpunctuated sentence. "If you think you can turn your back on me and stay with them, you will pay with the only thing you love." Detective Alberto marched back into the precinct interrogation room and slammed the bundle of letters onto the metal table directly in front of Antonio. He looked at the father and demanded a full name. Antonio stared at the pink ribbon, his chest heaving, and he completely broke down. He confessed that he had been maintaining a passionate, secret affair with a 38-year-old woman who worked as a typist. But 3 weeks earlier, his wife had found an unfamiliar lipstick mark on his collar, and out of fear of losing his family and his social standing, Antonio had met with his lover and explicitly told her the affair was over, stating he would never see her again. The woman's name was Neda Maya Lopes. She lived alone in a small third-floor apartment located just 5 blocks away from Antonio's textile warehouse. Police units swarmed the residential street, prying the apartment door off its iron hinges with a heavy steel battering ram. The rooms were completely dark and empty, with the closets left wide open and clothes scattered across the floorboards. But on the small Formica kitchen counter, detectives found a copy of the morning newspaper, and the front-page article detailing the search for the missing 4-year-old girl had been carefully cut out with a pair of scissors. Nade was captured 3 hours later at a chaotic bus terminal near the northern exit of the city. She was sitting quietly on a wooden bench in the back corner of the waiting area, clutching a small leather valise and trying to blend in with a crowd of laborers. She was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and the same large, thick sunglasses described by the nursery school teacher. When the officers surrounded her and grabbed her arms, she did not scream or struggle. She simply looked up at Detective Alberto, removed her sunglasses, and financial styled nodded flatly, her face entirely devoid of expression. On the morning of July 2nd, while Nade was being processed at the Central Police Station, a group of young boys was walking through a dense, overgrown field of weeds in the industrial neighborhood of Penha, located several miles north of the city center. The district was filled with abandoned railway spurs and the rusted iron shells of old manufacturing plants that had gone bankrupt after the war. At the far edge of the field stood a massive derelict concrete structure that had once been used as a commercial livestock slaughterhouse. The windows were entirely smashed and the grand entrance was blocked by rotting wooden pallets. The boys climbed through a gap in the rusted, corrugated iron doors at the back to look for old copper pipes they could sell to a local scrapyard. As they walked deeper into the central killing floor, where heavy iron meat hooks still hung from the overhead steel beams, they noticed a thick, greasy plume of dark smoke rising from a small concrete utility room at the back of the collect building. They walked toward it, covering their mouths against a sharp chemical smell of fuel that filled the air. Inside the small room, next to an old brick furnace, lay a pile of charred debris on the floor. One of the older boys used a long wooden stick to push at the top layer of black ash. The debris shifted apart, revealing a small, unburned fragment of cotton fabric. It was white cloth, and attached to the edge was a small blue ribbon, completely blackened by soot, but still holding its shape. Next to the fabric lay a small, twisted silver chain with a flat metal plate. The boy leaned down and wiped away the layer of grime from the plate, revealing the letters TANINHA engraved into the metal. The boys dropped the stick, ran out of the slaughterhouse, and screamed for a group of railway workers down the track. Based on Nade's detailed confession to the magistrates, forensic analysis of the slaughterhouse floor and school records, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the afternoon of June 30th, 1960. At 3:30 p.m., a woman in a dark, patterned cotton dress and thick sunglasses walked up the concrete steps of the nursery school. She stopped in the entryway, pulled a forged note from her purse, and handed it to Sister Maria, her voice completely smooth and polite. When Tanina was led out into the main hallway, she looked up and instantly recognized the woman, whom she had seen visiting her father's warehouse office on several occasions. The woman smiled, handed the child a small piece of hard candy, and told her they were going to go see her father for a special surprise. Tanina took her hand without a single thought of danger. They walked down the crowded sidewalk to the nearest transit stop, boarding a public bus heading north toward the industrial zone of Penha. During the 40-minute ride, the woman sat completely still, occasionally stroking Tanina's blonde hair and handing her more sweets to keep her from asking questions about her mother. The other passengers on the crowded bus paid no attention to them. It simply looked like a mother traveling with her young daughter on a hot summer afternoon. They exited the bus at the final stop near the railway tracks and walked into the overgrown field toward the derelict slaughterhouse. The woman led the child through the broken rear door into the dark, damp interior of the concrete building. Tanina began to grow nervous, complaining about the cold air and the heavy smell of old stone, and she tightly gripped the woman's dress, asking to go back to her mother. The woman did not answer. She led the child into the small concrete utility room at the back, shut the heavy wooden door, and pulled a short, solid iron window bar from her canvas bag. The strike was delivered instantly from behind, and the child dropped to the floor without making a sound. The woman stood over the body in the absolute silence of the abandoned slaughterhouse for several minutes, watching the dust motes float in the thin slivers of sunlight coming through the cracked roof. Then she poured a tin container of kerosene over the remains, and the surrounding debris struck a single wooden match and walked calmly out into the weeds as the room filled with black smoke. She walked back to the bus terminal, entirely convinced that she had delivered the ultimate punishment to the man who had discarded her. The press immediately labeled her a Fera da Penha, which translates to the Beast of Penha. The trial in late 1960 drew thousands of furious citizens to the steps of the Rio de Janeiro Court of Justice, requiring a massive cordon of military police with fixed bayonets to prevent the crowd from tearing the transport vehicle apart. Neida Maya Lopes maintained an attitude of absolute indifference throughout the entire legal proceeding, sitting flatly in her chair and refusing to look at Antonio or his family. She was found guilty of premeditated homicide and sentenced to 33 years in prison, though due to state penal limitations at the time she was released after serving 15 years. Antonio Maria closed his textile distribution warehouse less than a month after the final sentencing was handed down, selling his remaining inventory at a massive loss. He and his wife packed their belongings into a single truck and moved out of Rio de Janeiro to a remote farming village in the interior of the country, where they changed their names and lived in complete isolation. The old concrete slaughterhouse in Penha remained abandoned for decades, its high walls slowly collapsing under the weight of thick green ivy and wild weeds, a silent gray marker for an act of pure vengeance. On the afternoon of May 1st, 1963A16, year-old high school student named Yoshie Nakata packed her textbooks into her canvas school bag and left her classroom in Sayama City, Japan. It was a clear, warm spring day, and the streets were filled with the sound of bicycles rattling over gravel and shopkeepers sliding back their wooden doors to let the breeze in. Children ran across the narrow lanes between the lush green tea fields without their parents, and neighbors nodded to each other as they swept their dirt doorsteps. Yoshie was in a good mood because it was her older sister's birthday and the family was planning a small dinner at their farmhouse later that evening. She waved goodbye to her classmates at the school gate and started her usual walk home along the edge of the farming plots. The Nakata family lived on a modest farm on the rural outskirts of the city, where their daily schedule was governed entirely by the seasons and the demands of the harvest. Yoshie's father spent his days working the soil, while her older sister managed the household tasks, cooking rice over the kitchen hearth and washing the laundry in large wooden tubs. Yoshi was known in her family as the energetic one, always laughing and rushing through her chores so she could read magazines or practice her handwriting. Her sister had spent the morning preparing a special meal, and as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, she set the table and waited for Yoshie to walk through the front door. But by 6:00 p.m., the kitchen had grown completely quiet and the rice in the pot had gone cold. Yoshie's sister stood by the front gate, shielding her eyes from the setting sun, looking down the long dirt road that cut through the tea bushes. Usually Yoshie was home by 4:30 p.m., at the absolute latest, and she never went anywhere without telling her family first. The sister walked back inside and asked her brother if Yoshie had mentioned staying late for a school club or visiting a friend's house, but he shook his head. So her brother got on his bicycle and pedaled down the dark road toward the high school, checking the ditches and shouting his sister's name into the wind, but the road was completely empty. Around 7:30 p.m., while the family was sitting in the living room, trying to figure out which neighbor's house to call first, the father heard a faint rustling sound at the front entrance. He stood up, pushed open the wooden sliding door, and looked out into the yard, but there was nobody there. However, when he looked down at the threshold, he noticed a folded piece of white paper resting on the straw mat. He picked it up, unfolded it under the oil lamp, and his hands began to shake. The paper was covered in columns of highly complex formal Japanese characters written with a steady, confident brushstroke. The letter stated that Yoshi had been taken, and if the family ever wanted to see her alive again, they needed to bring 200,000 yen in cash to a specific location at midnight on May 2nd. The note explicitly stated that if the family contacted the police, Yoshi would be killed immediately. But 2,000,000 yen was an astronomical sum of money for a rural farming family in 1963, an amount they couldn't possibly raise on their own in 24 hours. So out of absolute desperation, the father ran to the local police precinct and handed the note to the officer on duty, within an hour. The small station was packed with senior investigators from the Saitama Prefectural Headquarters. They looked at the sophisticated language in the note and concluded that they were dealing with an educated, highly organized criminal who had spent weeks planning this abduction. The investigators told the family that they were going to set up a massive sting operation to catch the kidnapper at the drop-off point. They spent the next day assembling a package of fake money-wrapping blocks of scrap paper and a few real banknotes to make the bundle look authentic. The drop-off location chosen by the kidnapper was a dark, isolated crossroads near a dense thicket of trees on the edge of town. The police decided that Yoshi's older sister would be the one to physically deliver the package, as the kidnapper would be less likely to panic if he saw a young woman approaching alone. The sister was worried, but she looked at the empty seat at the dinner table and agreed to do it. Just before midnight on May 2nd, a heavy mist rolled in over the tea fields, dropping the temperature and reducing visibility to just a few yards. The older sister walked slowly down the middle of the dirt crossroads, clutching the heavy package of money against her chest. Her heart was pounding so loudly against her ribs that she was sure anyone standing near her could hear it. Unknown to her, the police had deployed 40 undercover officers into the surrounding brush. They were crouching in the wet grass, holding their breath, waiting for the suspect to make contact. The sister stopped at the center of the crossroads under the dim glow of a single distant street lamp and waited in the freezing air. A few minutes past midnight, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching on gravel came from the shadows of the tree line. A tall figure wrapped in a dark coat emerged from the mist and walked slowly toward the sister. He stopped about 10 feet away and spoke in a low, raspy voice, demanding that she hand over the cash bundle. The sister took a step forward, but right as she extended her arms, the man suddenly paused. He didn't look at the money. Instead, his eyes glanced past her, toward the deep shadows of the tea rows. He noticed a slight movement in the leaves, or perhaps the glint of a brass button on an officer's jacket. The man immediately turned around and sprinted back into the darkness. The moment he ran, the undercover officers leaped out of the brush, blowing whistles and flashing lanterns, shouting for the man to stop. They scrambled through the narrow rows of the tea farm, but the mist was too thick and the layout of the fields was incredibly confusing. The investigators ran into each other in the dark, tripping over irrigation ditches and losing their footing in the mud. By the time they managed to regroup at the edge of the property, the suspect had completely vanished into the night. The sting operation had been a total disaster. The next morning, the local newspapers ran massive, blistering headlines criticizing the police department for their incompetence, pointing out that 40 trained officers had allowed a single man to slip through their fingers. The pressure on the investigators was immense, and the department deployed over 100 officers to conduct a grid search of the entire city. On May 4th, a search team was moving through a remote section of an agricultural plot, just a few miles from the Nakata farm. An officer noticed that the soil near a pile of discarded fertilizer bags looked fresh and loose. He walked over, brushed away a layer of dirt, and found a shallow grave. Yoshi's body was inside, bound and murdered, shortly after her abduction. The public outrage in Japan was unprecedented. The media accused the police of being completely incapable of protecting regular citizens, and the chief of police was forced to make a public apology on television. The investigators knew that if they didn't make an arrest immediately, their careers would be completely ruined. So, they stopped looking for complicated clues and focused their attention on a small, segregated settlement on the edge of Sayama City. This neighborhood was home to the Burakumin community, a historical outcast group in Japan that had faced severe social discrimination for centuries. The police believed that the local residents were desperate for money and would be easy targets for an arrest. On May 23rd, the police swarmed a modest wooden shack in the settlement and arrested a 24-year-old Burakumin laborer named Kazuo Ishikawa. Kazuo was a quiet, introverted young man who made a meager living doing heavy manual labor on local farms. The police hauled him to the precinct, threw him into a small, windowless concrete cell, and locked the door. For the next 28 days, Kazuo was held in complete isolation. He was not allowed to see his family, and he was completely denied access to a lawyer. The detectives took turns entering his cell, screaming at him for hours, pounding on the table, and telling him that if he didn't sign a confession, they would ensure he was executed immediately. Kazuo was completely overwhelmed by the constant psychological pressure. He was sleep-deprived, malnourished, and worried about what the detectives might do to him. He kept telling them that he had been at home sleeping on the night of the abduction, but they refused to listen to his alibi. Finally, a senior detective sat down across from him, softened his tone, and told Kazuo that if he just put his signature on a pre-written statement, the judge would understand it was an accident and he would be allowed to go home to his family in a few months. Kazuo, exhausted and desperate for the nightmare to end, took the pen and signed his name at the bottom of the document. The case was brought to the Tokyo High Court, and the prosecutors proudly presented Kazuo's signed confession as the definitive proof of his guilt. They told the jury that Kazuo had masterminded the entire operation, abducting the girl, writing the ransom note, and evading the police at the crossroads. But during the trial, Kazuo's defense team brought forward a detail that completely stunned the courtroom. Kazuo Ishikawa had never attended elementary school due to his family's extreme poverty and their status as outcasts. He was entirely illiterate. He could not read a single sentence in a newspaper, and he didn't even know how to write the basic alphabet, let alone the highly complex literary characters used to pen the ransom note. The defense argued that it was physically impossible for an illiterate farm laborer to have composed a sophisticated, elegant letter demanding a ransom. But the judges, desperate to close the case and appease the furious media, ignored the defense entirely. They ruled that Kazuo could have memorized the characters or had someone else write it for him, despite having no evidence of an accomplice. In October of 1963, Kazuo was found guilty and sentenced to death, a sentence that was later commuted to life in prison. He was locked away in a high-security penitentiary, while the true author of the ransom note remained completely free. The tragedy of the boggled investigation did not end with Kazuo's wrongful conviction. Yoshi's older sister, who had stood at the crossroads that misty night holding the fake money, was completely consumed by grief and guilt. She blamed herself for letting the killer get away, and just a short time after the trial concluded, she took her own life. Kazuo Ishikawa served 31 years in a concrete cell before he was finally paroled in 1994. He emerged from prison as an elderly man, but he refused to stay quiet, dedicating every single day of his remaining life to fighting the legal system to officially clear his name and find the real author of the note. Based on the forensic documents, the timing of the school dismissal and the location of the shallow grave here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe actually happened on that spring afternoon. A man sits on a wooden bench near the edge of a tea field watching the high school gate open. He sees a young girl with a canvas school bag walk past him alone, heading down the dirt path. He stands up, follows her into a secluded section of the road where the bushes are tall enough to hide them from the main highway, and intercepts her. He forces her off the path into an old agricultural shed, binds her wrists with twine, and sits down at a wooden table. He pulls out an ink brush and a sheet of paper, carefully composing a highly detailed, flawless ransom note, demanding 2,000,000 yen, knowing exactly how to word the text to manipulate her family. The next night, the man walks through the heavy mist toward the crossroads, spotting the sister standing alone under the dim street lamp. He approaches to take the package, but his eyes catch a slight movement in the deep shadows of the tea rows, the unmistakable glint of an officer's uniform badge. He drops his head, turns around, and disappears into the darkness of the fields. He knows perfectly, leaving the police to hunt a ghost. The official conviction of Kazuo Ishikawa has never been overturned by the Japanese appellate courts, and the identity of the person who actually penned the complex letter remains legally unresolved. A sheet of white paper covered in elegant ink can lock a man away in a concrete room for over 3 decades, while the real hands that held the brush fade quietly into the background of a crowded city. But sometimes a piece of paper isn't used to demand a ransom, and it isn't hidden away in a police evidence locker. Sometimes, an untraceable message is left right inside the pocket of a discarded coat, left waiting in the middle of a barren field for someone to finally read the secret letters. The ocean was black and the wood was cold. 11-year-old Terry Jo Duperall lay tucked inside her small bunk below the deck of the sailboat, her eyes snapping open in the dark. It was the middle of the night and something was wrong. She heard a sharp, high-pitched scream from the deck above her head, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots scrambling across the planks. Then, absolute silence. Terry Jo swung her legs out of her bunk, her bare feet touching the floorboards. She felt her way through the dark cabin and climbed the steep wooden ladder leading to the main deck. When her head cleared the hatch, she took a single step, and the bottom of her foot sank into something thick and sticky. In the pale moonlight, the liquid covering the polished mahogany looked completely black. A few feet away, a man stood near the railing, his chest heaving as he pulled at a heavy nylon line. He turned around, his eyes locking onto the 11-year-old girl standing in the dark. He did not say a word. He simply reached down, grabbed a thick rope tied to a small rubber dinghy, and tossed it toward her. But the knots were slick, and the line slipped right through his fingers, tumbling into the dark water. The man looked at the floating dinghy, looked back at Terry Jo, and then leaped over the side of the boat into the ocean. He swam away, leaving her completely alone on a vessel that was already groaning as the water began to rush over the deck rails. Before we get into the rest of what happened on that boat, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do on this channel. We upload multiple times every single week to keep you up at night. So if that sounds like something you want to listen to, please walk right up to the like button. Offer to buy it a nice cold drink on a hot summer afternoon, but right before you hand it over, drop a handful of coarse salt straight into the cup. Also, please make sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss an episode. Okay, let's get back to the story. To understand how an 11-year-old girl ended up alone on a sinking ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, we have to look back to the early months of 1,961 inches, the town of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Dr. Arthur Duperall was a 41-year-old optometrist who spent his days inside a brightly lit medical office examining eye charts, sliding lenses into metal frames, and helping the local residents pick out prescription glasses. Arthur was a successful professional, but he lived a modest, quiet life with his wife Jean and their 3 young children. They lived in a normal suburban neighborhood where the winter snow accumulated in massive drifts against the garage doors by November, and the family routines revolved around school buses, hot soup, and local community gatherings. But Arthur had a specific goal that he had been working toward for nearly a decade. He had opened a private savings account at his local bank, and every single month when his paycheck from the optometry practice was deposited, he took a set portion of the money and moved it into that account. He didn't tell his colleagues or his neighbors about it. He wanted to plan a trip that his children would remember for the rest of their lives. Arthur didn't want to just buy plane tickets to a crowded tourist resort or stay at a standard beachfront hotel. He wanted to take his family completely away from the Wisconsin winter travel down to the Coast Charter, a professional sailing vessel, and spend a full week navigating through the remote islands of the Bahamas. By the first week of November in 1961, the balance in the savings account had finally reached his target. The family packed their suitcases, loading winter coats and heavy boots into the back of their car, and pulled out of their driveway in Green Bay. They drove south for days, watching the snow disappear and the landscape turn into the flat, sandy expanses of southern Florida. When they arrived at the marina in Fort Lauderdale, Arthur finalized a lease agreement for a ship called the Bluebell. The Bluebell was a 60-foot twin-masted sailing ketch. It was a beautiful, expensive vessel with polished white sides, heavy brass cleats that caught the sunlight, and a spacious wooden cabin below deck that contained enough bunk beds to comfortably house the entire family. Arthur was a skilled optometrist, but he was not a deep-sea navigator, and he knew that handling a 60-foot ketch in the open ocean required professional expertise. Through the charter company at the marina, he was introduced to a man named Julian Harvey. Julian was 44 years old, and his resume was flawless. He was a highly decorated former Air Force pilot who had flown heavy B-24 bombers over Europe during World War II and had piloted fighter jets during the Korean War. Julian had a rigid military posture, a sharply squared jaw, and a quiet, respectful way of speaking that immediately made Arthur trust him. Julian was newly married, and he asked Arthur if his wife, a 34-year-old former airline stewardess named Mary Dene, could come along on the voyage to assist with the meals and keep the cabins clean. Arthur readily agreed, and the final crew was set. On Wednesday, November 8th, the Bluebell cast off from the Fort Lauderdale docks. Its diesel engine rumbled as Julian guided the ship out of the harbor channels and into the deep blue water of the Atlantic. The weather was clear, the wind was steady, and within a few hours the Florida coastline had shrunk into a thin gray line on the horizon. The family settled into a relaxed, predictable routine on the boat. Julian spent his hours at the mahogany steering wheel, adjusting the white canvas sails and tracking their coordinates on paper maps, while his wife Mary Dene worked in the small galley kitchen below deck, preparing fresh fruit and coffee. The three children spent every single hour of daylight out on the wooden deck. Arthur had bought them brand new snorkeling masks and rubber swim fins back in Wisconsin, and whenever Julian dropped the heavy iron anchor in the shallow turquoise waters near the reefs, the kids would dive over the side. 14-year-old Brian and 11-year-old Terry Jo would swim down to the sandy bottom, pulling up large pink conch shells and bringing them back to the boat to line up along the deck to dry in the sun. Little 7-year-old Renee would splash near the wooden ladder, laughing as the small silver fish darted around her ankles. To Arthur, looking out from the cabin window at his family, the trip was exactly what he had spent 10 years saving for. By Sunday afternoon, November 12th, the Bluebell was anchored just off the coast of a tiny remote settlement called Sandy Point on Great Abaco Island. Arthur went ashore in a small rubber dinghy to visit a local commissioner's office, where he filled out the official customs paperwork to clear the vessel for its return journey to Florida the following morning. That evening, Mary Denny cooked a large celebratory dinner in the galley. The family sat around the built-in wooden table, laughing about the sunburns on the kids' shoulders and packing away the conch shells they had collected. By 9:00 p.m., the children were exhausted from the days of swimming. Terry Jo said goodnight to her. Parents walked to her tiny sleeping quarters at the very back of the boat and fell into a deep sleep. When the scuffling sounds and the high-pitched scream dragged Terry Jo out of her sleep, she didn't know what time it was. The ship was tossing uncomfortably in the dark water. After climbing the ladder and seeing her mother and brother lying still on the wet deck, she had been shoved back down into the cabin by Julian Harvey. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her mind racing as the cold ocean water began to pour over the doorframe, filling her small room up to her ankles. She realized that the vessel was sinking beneath her feet, and she had to get out immediately. She waded back through the dark, flooded corridor, using her hands to guide herself up the wooden steps toward the open air. The main deck was completely tilted now, with the whitewood panels slick with water as the ocean poured over the side rails. Julian Harvey had already launched the small wooden dinghy and was preparing to abandon ship. When he tossed the nylon rope to Terry Jo and it slipped into the water, he didn't try to retrieve it. He simply turned his back on her, leaped over the side, and climbed into the small boat, rowing away into the darkness. Terry Jo looked around the deck as it began to disappear under the waves. She remembered seeing a small cork float lashed to the top of the main cabin roof. It was a simple rectangle of cork and wood measuring just 2 feet wide and 5 feet long, meant to be used as an emergency lifesaver. With the water rising past her knees, Terry Jo scrambled onto the cabin roof, her small fingers tearing at the tight rope knots holding the cork float down. She managed to pull the line free, just as a massive wave rolled over the bow. The Bluebell gave a heavy mechanical groan as the iron engine block dragged the ship down, and the vessel slid completely under the surface into the deep ocean. Terry Jo clung to the rough edges of the cork float as she was pulled under, but the buoyancy of the wood popped her back up to the surface. She dragged herself onto the flat top of the float, curling her small body into a ball as the dark water stretched out in every direction around her. When the sun came up on Monday morning, the temperature on the open water began to rise rapidly, eventually hitting 85 degrees. Terry Jo was wearing only a light, short-sleeved blouse and thin cotton slacks, with no shoes, no hat, and no protection from the light. The glare of the sun, reflecting off the ocean's surface, was completely blinding, burning the skin on her face and arms within a few hours. The salt spray dried on her body, forming a white crust that made her skin pull tight and crack. By Tuesday, her lips were split and bleeding, and her throat was so dry that her tongue began to swell, making it difficult for her to breathe. Small reef fish began to gather in the blue shadow beneath her cork, float their tiny bodies constantly bumping against her legs as they dangled in the water. Further out, larger dark shapes with tall fins began to break the surface, circling the float in wide, slow parameters. By Wednesday, the third day, without food or a single drop of fresh water, the severe dehydration began to affect Terry Jo's brain. She started seeing things that weren't there. She looked across the water and saw a massive desert island with green palm trees rising out of the waves, but when she blinked, it was just the white crest of a swell. She saw a large gray submarine surface right next to her raft, but it vanished into the sunlight when she reached out her hand. While Terry Jo was drifting out on the open ocean, a completely different scene was unfolding closer to the mainland. On Monday morning, a commercial oil tanker called the Gulf Lion was navigating through the shipping lanes off the coast of the Bahamas when the watch officer spotted a small wooden dinghy bobbing in the swells. The crew pulled the tanker alongside the small boat and lowered a ladder, helping a man climb aboard. The man was Julian Harvey, and he was sitting right next to the small, lifeless body of 7-year-old Renee Dupereau. The crew wrapped Julian in blankets and carried the young girl's body into the ship's medical bay. Julian was completely composed, his voice flat and steady, as he sat down with the ship's captain to explain what had happened. He stated that late Sunday night, while the Dupereau family was sleeping below deck, an incredibly sudden and violent squall had struck the Bluebelle. He claimed that the wind was so intense that it snapped the main wooden mast entirely, sending it crashing down through the cabin roof. Julian said the falling timber pierced the hull of the ship and severed the main fuel line in the engine room, causing an immediate massive fire to break out. He claimed that Arthur Jean and the two oldest children were instantly trapped behind a wall of flames and smoke. Julian explained to the captain that he had been on deck when the mast snapped, and he had jumped over the side to deploy the dinghy. He claimed that he saw little Renee floating unconscious in the water near the debris, and he managed to pull her into the boat, but she had already drowned by the time he reached her. The United States Coast Guard was notified, and they immediately checked the local weather stations and maritime logs for that night. There were indeed isolated heavy squalls recorded in that specific sector of the Atlantic. Julian was a highly decorated military veteran with a flawless record, and his testimony was precise. The authorities believed his story, completely treating him as a tragic hero who had survived a maritime disaster. Julian returned to Miami, where he checked into a room at the Sandman Motel and prepared to testify at a formal Coast Guard inquiry into the loss of the vessel. The local newspapers ran large photographs of him on the front page, detailing his military service and expressing sympathy for the loss of his new wife and his passengers. For 3 days, Julian sat before a panel of maritime officers, calmly recounting the details of the squall, the falling mast, and the fire in the engine room. The panel took extensive notes, and it looked like the investigation would be closed as a tragic accident caused by weather. Then came Thursday morning. It was Terry Jo's 84th hour out on the water. Her skin was severely blistered from the sun, and she had lost consciousness lying flat on her back on the rough cork surface. A crewman standing on the bridge of a Greek freighter called the Captain Theo was scanning the horizon through a pair of heavy binoculars, looking for shipping containers or large debris. He noticed a tiny white speck bobbing in the distance. He lowered his binoculars, thinking it was just a discarded packing crate, but something made him look again. He focused the lenses and saw a tiny, sun-blistered hand slowly raise up from the wood. The captain of the Captain Theo immediately altered the ship's course, slowing the massive freighter down as they pulled alongside the tiny cork float. The crew lowered a cargo basket down to the water, carefully sliding Terry Jo's frail body inside, and hoisted her up to the main deck. She was severely emaciated, her lips were black and split, and her eyes were swollen shut from the salt crust. The ship's doctor immediately began administering intravenous fluids. Terry Jo opened her cracked lips, whispered her full name to the doctor, and then went completely unconscious again. The crew immediately radioed the Coast Guard headquarters in Miami with the coordinates of the rescue. Back in the Miami courtroom, Julian Harvey was sitting at the witness table answering a question about the condition of the Bluebelle's life jackets when the rear doors of the room flew open. A Coast Guard officer hurried down the center aisle, holding a white teletype message, and handed it directly to the lead investigator on the panel. The investigator read the paper, his face turning completely pale. He looked across the table at Julian Harvey, cleared his throat, and stated that they had just received an official report from a Greek freighter. He said that 11-year-old Terry Jo Dupereau had been pulled from the water alive, and she was currently being transported to a hospital in Miami. Julian Harvey sat completely still in his chair, his jaw tightening as his eyes locked onto the paper in the investigator's hand. He swallowed hard, forced a small smile, and stated into the microphone that the news was absolutely wonderful. He then stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and asked the panel for a brief recess so he could gather his thoughts and prepare for the young survivor's arrival. The panel granted the request, and Julian walked out of the courtroom down the concrete steps of the building and got into his car. He drove directly back to the Sandman Motel, walked into his room, and slid the heavy night bolt into place. Based on the physical evidence later recovered from the ocean floor financial statements and the official statements delivered by Terry Jo to the FBI investigators from her hospital bed, here is a reconstruction of what actually happened on the Bluebelle on the night of November 12th, 1961. The man was completely broke, facing massive personal debts and multiple failed business ventures back on the mainland. Just 2 weeks before the charter boat left Fort Lauderdale, he had taken out a $20,000 double indemnity life insurance policy on his new wife, Mary Dene. Late Sunday night, while the rest of the family was asleep in their bunks below deck, the man confronted his wife near the bow of the ship, intending to push her over the side and stage her death as a maritime accident to collect the financial payout. But the woman struggled, screaming out into the dark as she fought back. Dr. Arthur Duperall heard the noise from his cabin, climbed up the wooden ladder to investigate, and caught the man in the middle of the attack. Realizing his insurance fraud scheme was completely exposed, the man grabbed a heavy metal winch handle from the deck floor and struck Arthur, killing him instantly, knowing he could leave 0 witnesses behind to testify to the local authorities. The man went below deck with a heavy filleting knife, systematically moving through the small cabins to eliminate Jean Bryan and little Renee while they were still in their beds. He left Terry Jo asleep in her remote berth at the back of the boat, assuming she would simply go down with the vessel. The man then opened the sea valves in the engine room, allowing the ocean water to flood the hull, and launched the wooden dinghy to secure his own escape. He dragged little Renee's body into the boat with him, intending to use her as prop evidence to support his fabrication of a tragic accident caused by a sudden squall. When the police officers arrived at the Sandman Motel on Friday morning to arrest him for multiple counts of first-degree murder, they knocked on the door and received no response. They forced the lock and found Julian Harvey dead on the bathroom floor, having taken his own life with a razor blade. Terry Jo Duperrault spent nearly 2 weeks inside the intensive care unit of a Miami hospital, undergoing extensive treatment for skin grafts, muscle atrophy, and severe exposure before being released into the custody of her aunt back in Green Bay, Wisconsin. She survived her ordeal, changed her name to Terry Duperrault Fassbender to protect her privacy, and eventually wrote a memoir detailing the loss of her family. The twisted metal hull of the Bluebell remains resting on the muddy floor of the Atlantic Ocean, sealed in total darkness beneath miles of water where no light ever reaches. On the morning of August 29, 1961, a group of tourists stood on the concrete observation deck at the Point Hellbronner station, which sat directly on the mountain border between Italy and France. The air at that altitude was thin and sharp, forcing the travelers to tuck their wool scarves tightly into their heavy winter coats as they waited in line. Many of them were holding small leather cases containing their Leica cameras, carefully winding the film wheels so they would be ready to capture the landscape once they stepped into the mountain tramway. This particular system, known as the Vallée Blanche Aerial Tramway, was considered an extraordinary feat of modern European engineering. It connected the Italian peak with the Aiguille du Midi station in France, stretching across a span of 3.5 miles of ice and rock without a single central support tower. The entire system relied on 3 massive parallel steel wires suspended directly over the giant glacier, and the passengers looked out through the glass windows of the terminal as the small 3-seater aluminum cabins began to click onto the main line. The daily operation of the tramway was handled by a small team of technicians who sat inside concrete control booths at both ends of the mountain span. These men spent their shifts monitoring large circular brass dials on the walls that tracked the constant tension of the cables as the cabins moved back and forth. The system was unique because the cabins didn't travel individually. They were linked together in small trains of 3 painted in bright red, blue, and yellow, so they would be easily visible against the white background of the snow. A thick stationary steel wire called the carrier cable supported the actual weight of the cars, while a thinner, continuously moving loop, known as the traction cable, towed the trains across the valley floor. Every 20 minutes, the electric motors in the terminal would groan, the massive steel bull wheels would begin to turn, and the cabins would slide out of the station, passing over a set of rubber-lined sheaves with a regular low clanking sound that the regular passengers had grown completely accustomed to. By 1:00 p.m. that afternoon, the sun had climbed to its highest point in the sky, reflecting an intense glare off the surface of the glacier below. Inside, one of the blue 3-seater cabins, suspended near the center of the span, an Italian family was adjusting their binoculars, looking down at the deep blue-shadowed crevasses that cut through the ice hundreds of feet beneath them. The cabin was small, basically just a sphere of thin aluminum and clear plexiglass panels that shook slightly whenever a sudden gust of wind came off the surrounding peaks. The passengers could hear the faint, steady humming of the steel traction wire moving through the guide rollers right above their roof, a sound that indicated the system was functioning exactly according to schedule. The cable cars were moving at a speed of about 9 feet per second, slowly approaching the midpoint of the journey, where the mountain drop was the deepest. But at exactly 1:15 p.m., a sudden violent shock wave ran through the entire length of the steel wire. Inside the blue cabin, the steady humming sound instantly stopped, replaced by a loud metallic bang that echoed off the granite walls of the surrounding peaks. The cabin dropped 3 feet vertically in a fraction of a second, snapping the passengers forward against the plexiglass panels before bouncing violently on the support wire. The travelers grabbed the metal handrails as the car began to spin and rock back and forth in a wide, erratic arc, the wheels of the top carriage grinding loudly against the frozen steel. Outside, the thin traction cable, which had been under thousands of pounds of hydraulic tension, was whipping through the air like a giant metal blade, curling and twisting into the valley below before going completely limp. Inside the concrete control room at the Aiguille du Midi terminal on the French side, the circular brass dials on the wall suddenly spun backward, the metal needles hitting the zero peg as the line tension dropped completely. The emergency sirens on the main panel clicked on, casting a flashing red light across the room while the electric motors ground to a halt with a smell of hot grease and burning rubber. The technicians scrambled to the observation windows, raising their long brass telescopes to look out across the 3-mile span. Through the lenses, they could see that the long line of red, blue, and yellow cabins had come to an absolute standstill, dangling motionless over the center of the glacier. But as the technicians tracked the telescope down toward the deepest section of the valley floor, they noticed a massive break in the traction wire, and 3 of the central cabins were completely missing from the line. The air inside the isolated cabins began to drop rapidly as the afternoon shadows from the surrounding Mont Blanc Massif stretched across the ice. The remaining 81 tourists were trapped inside the small aluminum bubbles, completely suspended hundreds of feet above the bottomless glacial crevasses with no way to communicate with the mountain stations. The small emergency vents in the roofs allowed the freezing alpine wind to whistle through the cabins, making the metal frames shake and vibrate continuously. The passengers tried to look through the frost-covered plexiglass, but the glare of the snow and the sheer drop beneath them made it impossible to see any sign of ground support. At the terminals, the technicians realized that the traction cable had been completely severed by an external force, and they immediately contacted the regional emergency services in Chamonix to launch an alpine rescue operation. Based on the official accident investigation files from the French Civil Aviation Authority and the historical rescue logs of the Italian Alpine Club, here is a reconstruction of what happened over the Mont Blanc Massif on the afternoon of August 29th, 1961. Early that morning, a flight of 4 Republic F-84F Thunderstreak fighter jets belonging to the French Air Force took off from the Luxeuil Air Base on a low-altitude tactical navigation training mission. The aircraft were heavy, swept-wing military bombers designed to navigate through rugged terrain at high speeds to evade radar detection. The pilot of the lead jet, Captain Bernard Ziegler, was navigating through a designated low-altitude flight corridor that cut directly through the high valleys of the French Alps. The jet was traveling at a speed of over 500 miles per hour, its single turbojet engine producing a deafening roar that rumbled through the granite canyons, as Ziegler maintained a flight path approximately 500 feet above the valley floor. As the formation cleared a high, jagged ridge near the section of the Valley Blanche tramway, the sun created a massive blind spot on the aluminum nose of the lead aircraft. Ziegler was flying visually, relying on topographic paper maps secured to his clipboard, but the thin steel cables of the tramway suspended high above the white glacier were completely invisible against the glare of the ice fields. The jet surged through the open-air gap at 500 miles per hour, its right wing slicing directly through the moving traction cable of the tramway. The immense speed and weight of the military aircraft snapped the steel wire instantly, and the severed end of the cable wrapped around the jet's wing mechanism for a fraction of a second before breaking free, tearing away a section of the aluminum fuel tank flap. Ziegler felt a sudden, sharp vibration shake his flight controls, but the engine maintained its power, and he was able to guide the damaged fighter jet back toward a military landing strip on the western plains. But back at the mountain span, the mechanical consequences of the impact were immediate and tan yun. The sudden violent tension spike caused by the jet's wing yanked the traction cable forward with such force that it tore 3 of the aluminum cabins completely off their guide mounts. The cars plunged 500 feet through the open air, crashing directly onto the hard, packed ice of the giant glacier below and sliding into the deep snowbanks. The remaining sections of the moving cable whipped backward, tangling around the support wires and locking the remaining cabins in place, trapping dozens of passengers in midair. By 3:00 p.m., a team of local mountain guides and alpine rescue experts arrived at the upper terminal station, carrying bundles of heavy hemp ropes, steel carabiners, and canvas body harnesses. The ground temperature on the glacier had dropped significantly, and a thick shelf of gray clouds was beginning to gather around the western ridges, threatening to bring a severe mountain storm that would ground any support aircraft. The rescue team realized that because the cabins were suspended so high above the crevasses, they couldn't use ladders or ground ropes to reach the trapped tourists. The only way to extract them was to climb out onto the remaining steel wires by hand. A veteran guide named Christian Mollier volunteered to lead the first extraction team out onto the high line. He put on 2 pairs of thick leather work gloves, secured a heavy steel rolling clamp to the carrier cable, and stepped off the concrete edge of the terminal platform into the open air. The wind was blowing at over 30 miles per hour, causing the single wire to sway and twist as Mollier began to slide himself forward centimeter by centimeter, using his hands to pull his body weight along the frozen metal. The wire was coated in a thin layer of slippery grease and frost, making it incredibly difficult to maintain a grip. Below him, the valley fell away into a sheer drop of 500 feet, the white surface of the glacier looking like a flat sheet of paper from that height. It took Mollier nearly 40 minutes of intense physical exertion just to reach the first stranded red cabin. He crawled onto the top of the aluminum frame, his boots scraping against the metal as he leaned down over the side to knock on the frost-covered plexiglass window. Inside, he could see 3 passengers shivering violently, their faces completely pale from the cold and the shock of the hours of isolation. Mollier used a steel wrench to pry open the emergency mechanical lock on the cabin door, forcing the panel back against the wind. He spoke in a calm, steady voice, instructing the first passenger to slide out of the seat and step into the canvas rescue harness he had carried down the line. The process of lowering the passengers was incredibly slow and meticulous. One by one, the tourists were strapped into the harness, and Mollier secured the line to a manual brake block attached to the support cable. He slowly paid out the rope, letting the passengers slide down through the open air toward the surface of the glacier below, where a ground team of doctors and guides stood waiting with wooden sleds and blankets. If a single knot slipped or the leather gloves wore through from the friction of the rope, the passenger would fall directly into the crevasses. Mollier maintained his position on top of the swinging cabin for hours, his hands growing numb as the sun dropped behind the mountains. As night fell over the Mont Blanc Massif, the temperature plummeted well below freezing, and the rescue operation had to be temporarily halted due to the absolute darkness and the increasing wind speeds. More than 30 tourists had to remain inside the dark swinging cabins throughout the night, listening to the metal frames groan against the steel wires as the storm swept through the high passes. The ground teams set up campfires on the ice below, using lanterns to keep track of the cabin positions, in case the support wires began to give way under the weight of the ice accumulation. At dawn the following morning, the rescue teams returned to the lines using a specialized petrol-powered winch system to slide additional guides down the cables to speed up the extractions. By 10:00 a.m. on August 30th, the final passenger was lowered onto the snow almost 24 hours after the fighter jet had first severed the line. The ground teams loaded the survivors onto rescue sleds and began the long trek back down the mountain tracks toward the regional hospital in Chamonix. The official casualty report compiled by the French gendarmerie confirmed that 6 individuals were killed instantly when their cabins fell onto the glacier during the initial impact, while all 81 of the remaining trapped passengers were successfully extracted from the line without a single injury during the rescue operation. A formal military inquiry was launched into the flight regulations of the French Air Force, resulting in a strict ban on all low-altitude tactical training missions within 5 miles of any commercial cable car systems or mountain transit lines throughout the entire Alpine region. Captain Bernard Ziegler faced a lengthy judicial investigation regarding the navigation parameters of his flight, but he was ultimately cleared of criminal negligence due to the official maps failing to mark the vertical hazards of the Vallée Blanche span. The damaged traction cable was completely removed from the valley floor, 2 months later replaced by a new high-tensile wire system with automated radar warning beacons installed on the terminal roofs to ensure that the airspace above the giant glacier remained entirely clear. On the afternoon of October 27th, 1962, A 56-year-old corporate executive named Enrico Mattei walked across the damp asphalt of the Fontanarossa airfield in Catania, Sicily. The air was thick with the scent of aviation fuel and coastal low clouds, and the ground crews were hurrying to finish refueling his twin-engine private jet, a Moran Saulnier MS, 760 Paris. Waiting for Enrico in the cockpit was his personal pilot, Irnerio Bertuzzi, a highly decorated veteran fighter pilot who had logged thousands of hours navigating through complex weather systems. Joining them on the flight was William McHale, a 39-year-old American journalist and bureau chief for Time Life magazines, who had spent the last week interviewing Enrico about his massive operations. Enrico had spent the previous 48 hours traveling through small Sicilian towns, meeting with regional directors and checking on a new methane gas drilling rig. And now he was anxious to get back to his main headquarters in Milan for a series of high-level board meetings scheduled for the next morning. Now, Enrico was not a typical corporate manager, and his presence on that airfield was something that people in high offices around the world were tracking very closely. He was the director of Eni, Italy's state-owned energy company, and he had built it completely from the ground up through sheer stubbornness. Right after World War II, the new Italian government had given Enrico explicit orders to liquidate the old state petroleum assets, which everyone believed were completely worthless and a waste of public funds. But Enrico simply refused to follow those instructions. He secretly kept his drilling crews working in the fields, moved funds around without government approval, and eventually discovered massive, untapped reserves of methane gas in the Po Valley. He used that gas to build a sprawling network of cheap pipelines across the country, single-handedly fueling the nation's post-war industrial miracle and making himself one of the most popular public figures in the country. But Enrico did not want to stop at the Italian border, and that was where he started making some of the most dangerous enemies on the planet. He decided to take his company into the international market to secure cheap oil directly for Italian consumers, which meant he had to compete face-to-face with the dominant Anglo-American oil corporations. A powerful group of executives he openly referred to as the Seven Sisters. Enrico walked into oil-rich regions in the Middle East and North Africa and completely upended the traditional corporate playbook. While the major international companies always insisted on a strict 50-50 profit split that left local governments with very little control over their resources, Enrico offered those countries a 75% share of the revenue along with full operational partnerships. He even went so far as to sign a massive contract to import cheap crude oil directly from the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. A move that caused senior officials inside the CIA and major executives in New York and London to view him as a direct threat to global stability. Because of these international deals, Enrico lived a life of constant vigilance. He knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with, and he regularly received anonymous letters at his desk, containing detailed sketches of automobile accidents and newspaper clippings, where his personal schedule had been underlined in heavy black ink. He never traveled without a personal security detail. And his private jet was always kept inside a locked, heavily guarded hangar whenever it was on the ground. On this particular afternoon in Catania, the local airfield weather station was already reporting a massive wall of autumn rain and dense fog rolling over the northern plains of Italy. But Enrico nodded to his pilot, climbed the metal steps into the small cabin, and told him they needed to take off immediately. The private jet lifted off the Catania runway at exactly 4:57 p.m., climbing rapidly through the gray cloud banks and heading north over the open water of the Tyrrhenian Sea. The flight was calculated to take just under an hour and a half. Inside the small four-seat cabin, the entire routine was completely normal, with Bertuzzi monitoring the altimeter, adjusting the radio frequencies, and communicating with regional radar stations along the flight path. Enrico sat in the rear leather seat looking over a stack of new drilling contracts and chatting casually with Mikhail about the political landscape of North African oil concessions. The twin jet engines maintained a steady, high-pitched mechanical whine that filled the small space completely, masking the sound of the wind hitting the aluminum skin of the fuselage as the plane moved over the mountains. By 6:30 p.m., the aircraft was descending into the airspace surrounding Milan, where the autumn weather had deteriorated into a severe, localized thunderstorm. The cloud ceiling had dropped to less than 500 feet, and the heavy rain was cutting visibility down to almost zero. The ground controllers at Linate Airport were tracking the jet's radar signal on their glowing green screens as Bertuzzi began his approach sequence descending through the dark layers of fog. The pilot radioed the tower at 6:55 p.m. stating that he had passed the outer marker lights and was preparing to perform his final approach and drop his wheels. The controller acknowledged the message, instructing the pilot to maintain his current heading and watch the green blip move slowly across the glass grid until at exactly 6:57 p.m. The blip simply blinked and vanished from the display. 2 miles away, near the small farming community of Bascapé, a local farmer named Mario Migliavacca was standing inside his wooden barn checking the roof latches due to the intense downpour. The night was entirely dark, and the rain was hitting the metal panels of the outbuildings with a regular deafening roar. Suddenly, Mario heard a low, dull thud come from the sky directly above his fields, a sound that was completely different from the regular rolls of thunder. He walked to the edge of the barn door, pulled back the canvas curtain, and looked out across his potato rows. He saw a sudden bright flash of white and orange light illuminate the gray clouds for a fraction of a second, followed immediately by a shower of small burning metal fragments that spiraled down through the dark and hissed as they hit the wet mud. The local fire crews and police units arrived at the potato field within 30 minutes, navigating through the deep ditches with hand lanterns and portable flashlights. The debris from the private jet was scattered across a wide expanse of the agricultural plot, with smaller pieces of insulation and wire hanging from the branches of broken willow trees. The main engines had plowed deep into the soft earth, creating a smoking, muddy crater that smelled heavily of vaporized aviation fuel and burnt rubber. There were no survivors, and the recovery team spent the rest of the night gathering the remains of Enrico Mattei, Ernesto Bertuzzi, and William McHale, which had been completely shattered by the violence of the impact. Within 24 hours, the Italian Ministry of Defense took complete administrative control of the site, establishing a strict military perimeter around the potato field and preventing local journalists from interviewing the farmers. A special government inquiry panel was quickly assembled consisting of senior military officers and aviation bureaucrats. They spent less than 2 weeks examining the records, focusing almost entirely on the severe weather reports and the pilot's medical files. The final report issued by the panel concluded that Bertuzzi had experienced sudden spatial disorientation while flying through the thick clouds and heavy rain, causing him to accidentally guide the aircraft directly into the ground at full speed. The case was officially closed as a tragic weather accident. The metal fragments were placed into storage boxes, and the files were neemfong in a government archive. For more than 3 decades, that official accident report remained the final legal word on the matter, and the memory of Enrico Mattei slowly faded into corporate history textbooks. His successors at the State Oil Company quickly modified the controversial contracts with foreign nations, and the tension with the international oil cartels quieted down. But the local residents in the village of Bascapé never completely accepted the government's explanation of pilot error. Mario Migliavacca and the other farmers who had been outside that night continued to tell their children about the specific order of what they had seen, how the bright flash of fire had appeared high in the air, lighting up the entire sky, long before any part of the aircraft ever touched the ground. In the mid-1990s, a senior public prosecutor named Vincenzo Callia was assigned to the Regional Judicial District of Pavia, which included the agricultural lands where the jet had crashed. Callia was a highly methodical, quiet man who had spent his career untangling complicated financial fraud and political corruption cases. While reviewing some old, unorganized archive boxes in the basement of the courthouse, he came across the original 1,962 handwritten statements from the Bascapé farmers, and noticed that the military panel had completely excluded the descriptions of the mid-air flash from the official record. Callia realized that the physical evidence had never been subjected to independent evaluation, and he formally reopened the case as a multiple homicide investigation. Callia knew that after more than 30 years, paper records and old interviews would be entirely unreliable, so he decided to base his entire investigation on the advancements of modern forensic science. He ordered the complete exhumation of the remains of Enrico Mattei, the pilot and the journalist, along with the retrieval of every surviving piece of the Morane-Saulnier jet from the state storage facility. The bone samples and the twisted aluminum panels were sent to a team of ballistics experts, molecular chemists, and metallurgists at the University of Pavia. The specialists placed the metal skin of the cockpit floorboards under high-powered electron microscopes. And as they analyzed the structural integrity of the material, they made a discovery that completely changed the case. The edges of the aluminum panels surrounding the land bay were deformed and rolled violently from the inside out, displaying a specific type of microscopic pitting and metal tearing that can only be produced by a high-velocity shock wave. Furthermore, a detailed forensic analysis of Enrico's skeletal remains revealed microscopic splinters of gold and steel embedded directly into the front surface of his bone tissue, matching the exact internal components of his personal wristwatch and the dashboard instruments. It was not pilot error, and it was not a weather accident. A small explosive charge, containing less than 100 grams of a specialized military compound, had been planted directly behind the cockpit instrument panel, wired to detonate the exact second the pilot activated the mechanism to lower his wheels. The forensic data proved that the private jet had been intentionally sabotaged while sitting on the runway in Catania, turned into a calculated trap that would function perfectly until the final minutes of the journey. With the physical proof of an explosion now verified, Prosecutor Callia launched a massive review of the historical flight records and airfield logs from October of 1962. He discovered that on the night before the fatal flight, the security logs for the private hangar in Catania had a suspicious 2-hour gap where the guard on duty had left his post to respond to a sudden family medical emergency that investigators later verified was completely nui tau. Based on the internal metal deformation patterns, the chemical analysis of the skeletal splinters, and the verified gaps in the airfield security logs, here is a reconstruction of what occurred on the afternoon of October 27th. 1962. A man wearing a standard grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit walks calmly across the concrete floor of the private hangar at the Catania airfield during the scheduled absence of the guard. He carries a small leather tool bag containing a standard set of wrenches and a compact explosive package no larger than a cigarette case. He opens the side maintenance panel located directly beneath the cockpit floorboards of the Morane-Saulnier jet, prying back the canvas insulation blankets to locate the primary hydraulic and electrical lines. The man spends less than 10 minutes prying apart the terminal strips, cutting the insulation tape, and splicing the detonator wires directly into the primary electrical line for the landing gear indicator lights. He places the small charge flat against the rear casing of the dashboard instruments, replaces the insulation, blanket secures the panel screws, and walks out into the afternoon air, leaving the aircraft fully functional for its regular takeoff sequence. Hours later, as the private jet moves through the dense cloud banks over the northern plains, the pilot checks his coordinates, extends his hand to the central console, and pushes the heavy mechanical toggle downward to lower the landing wheels for the final approach to Line 8 Airport. The movement of the switch sends a sudden surge of electrical current down the copper wires toward the landing gear motors, but the current hits the spliced detonator first. The small charge explodes instantly, blowing the metal instrument panel backward into the cabin, severing the primary steering cables, and shattering the pilot's hands before he can even register the flash of fire, sending the jet into a podical terminal vertical dive into the potato fields below. In 1997, Prosecutor Vincenzo Callia officially submitted his final judicial report to the Italian court system, legally changing the official classification of Enrico Matte's death from an aviation accident to a premeditated multiple homicide. Due to the passage of more than 3 decades, the deliberate destruction of corporate registries from that era, and the deaths of the primary political figures who had been suspected of ordering the hit, no specific individuals could be formally indicted for organizing the sabotage. Enrico Mattei was 56 years old when his aircraft was destroyed, and his remains were returned to a small stone plot in his family's hometown of Metellica. A small package of explosive material can be completely hidden inside the familiar mechanics of a dashboard, turning a routine journey into a calculated trap, while the world below looks up and sees nothing but rain hitting the trees. But sometimes a deliberate plan doesn't involve moving parts, electrical wires, or a target wrapped in international corporate contracts. Sometimes a group of young men can step onto a simple wooden deck for a routine winter shift, entirely unaware that the weather around them is about to shift, leaving them to face a silent open expanse, where their only tool for survival is what they are wearing on their feet. On a freezing afternoon in January of 1960, a 21-year-old junior sergeant named Askat Zaganshin stood on the slippery steel deck of a small military landing craft moored in Kasatka Bay. Iturup Island, part of the remote and windswept Kuril chain between Russia and Japan, was a brutal assignment for young military conscripts. The volcanic cliffs surrounding the bay did little to block the sub-zero winds screaming down from the northern Siberian steppes, turning the ocean spray into thick sheets of white ice the moment it touched the rocky shore. The boys spent their nights huddled near small coal stoves in the barracks, listening to the wood frame groan against the pressure of the gale. Zyganshin was in charge of a small four-man crew, which included Filip Poplavsky, Anatoly Kryuchkovsky, and Ivan Fedotov. They were all simple farm boys and factory workers, drafted into the Soviet military from remote agricultural provinces, accustomed to hard physical labor, but completely untrained for deep-sea navigation. Their vessel, simply designated as the T-36, was a 50-foot self-propelled steel barge with a flat bottom, a single diesel engine, and a tiny enclosed wheelhouse near the stern. The metal hull was cold to the touch, painted in a dull military gray that was already beginning to rust along the weld seams from the constant exposure to salt water. The T-36 was never meant to face the open ocean. It was designed strictly as a workhorse for the garrison running back and forth between large cargo ships anchored in the deep water and the shallow sandy beaches of the bay. The crew spent their days moving heavy barrels of oil crates of winter rations and chunks of coal to keep the base heaters running. It was monotonous. Exhausting work that left their hands calloused and their faces stained with coal dust. But it was predictable, and the boys knew exactly when their shift would end each night. They looked forward to the hot cabbage soup waiting for them in the mess hall. But on Sunday, January 17th, the barometric pressure over the Kuril Islands plummeted faster than the base meteorologists had ever seen in their records. By mid-afternoon, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple and a violent Arctic hurricane slammed into Kasatka Bay. The wind surged to over 40 miles per hour within minutes, ripping across the shallow water and kicking up massive 15-foot waves that lifted the flat-bottomed steel barge and dropped it violently against the wooden pylons of the mooring pier. The sky was filled with a dense, blinding spray of freezing sleet that coated everything in sight. Zyganshin and his crew scrambled onto the wet deck, trying frantically to secure additional nylon lines to hold the craft to the dock before the timber crushed their hull. But the force of the surging water was too immense for the ropes. With a sound like a rifle shot, one of the thick steel mooring cables snapped under the extreme tension, whipping back across the deck and tearing away a large chunk of the metal railing. Seconds later, the remaining lines gave way with a succession of loud pops, and the T-36 was wrenched out into the churning, foam-covered waters of the bay. Zyganshin immediately ordered the diesel engine, started taking the wooden wheel himself to fight the gale. He wanted to steer the barge directly onto the sandy beach to ground it safely, but the wind was blowing straight off the land, pushing them backward into the deep water. The flat bottom of the craft slid violently over a hidden reef, grinding against the jagged rocks with a loud, metal-rending mechanical screech that damaged the propeller blades and caused the steering alignment to jam. The small craft was now drifting sideways, unable to maintain a heading as the waves broke over the low sides. Water began spraying over the small wheelhouse, freezing instantly on the thick glass windows and completely blocking their view of the shore. The boys took turns rushing onto the pitching deck with shovels and iron bars, trying to clear the heavy blankets of ice that were building up on the bow, knowing that if the barge became too top-heavy, it would capsize into the freezing water. They fought the storm for over 14 hours in the pitch black, using up almost their entire supply of diesel fuel, just trying to keep the bow pointed into the waves as the temperature continued to plummet. In the early morning hours, a massive wave slammed into the side of the T-36, throwing it against a large metal marker buoy and puncturing a small hole in the steel hull near the waterline. As freezing water began to hiss into the engine compartment, the diesel engine spluttered, coughed twice, and died completely, before the men could patch the leak with scrap wood and canvas rags. The Arctic wind shifted, dragging the crippled, unpowered barge out of the mouth of Kasatka Bay and straight into the trackless expanse of the open Pacific Ocean. The next morning, the hurricane finally broke, and the sun came up over a completely flat, silent sea. Zyganshin climbed out of the hatch and looked around, but the volcanic cliffs of Iturup Island were entirely gone. There was nothing but an endless gray horizon stretching out in every direction with no landmarks to guide them. He gathered the 3 crew members down in the small, dark hold to assess their situation, and when they opened the supply lockers, a heavy silence settled over the room. They realized that no one on the base knew where they had been dragged by the wind. Because they had only expected to be out in the bay for a standard day shift, they hadn't packed any survival rations or extra water. Their entire inventory consisted of a single loaf of heavy rye bread, a small jar containing a few spoonfuls of dry buckwheat groats, 3 small tins of stewed pork meat, and a single metal kettle filled with fresh water. They had no working radio to transmit a distress signal. Their navigation compass had been shattered during the impact with the reef, and they were drifting blindly into one of the most isolated sectors of the ocean. Zygantian knew that their only chance of survival was extreme, calculated discipline. He took out his pocket knife and carefully divided the single loaf of rye bread into tiny, uniform cubes, placing them inside a small metal tobacco tin. He announced that each man would receive a single cube of bread, no larger than a matchbox, once every 48 hours. They opened the first tin of stewed meat using a small spoon to divide the congealed fat and the pork into 4 microscopic portions, chewing each bite for minutes to make the flavor last. The temperature inside the uninsulated steel hold dropped well below freezing every single night. The moisture from their breath rose to the ceiling and froze instantly, forming thick sheets of white frost that lined the metal walls like ice inside a commercial freezer. They had no wood for the stove and no heater, so the boys had to huddle tightly together on a single wooden bunk. Wrapping themselves in a pile of wet canvas tarps and using their combined body heat to keep from freezing to death in the pitch black. They talked in low whispers about their families to pass the time. By the end of January, the small kettle of fresh water was completely empty, and the hunger had turned into a constant, gnawing physical ache in their midsections. To keep from dying of dehydration, they had to crawl down into the belly of the barge to locate the emergency cooling lines for the dead engine. The water inside the pipes was brown and bitter, filled with flakes of red rust and smelling heavily of diesel grease, but they carefully drained it into a tin cup, straining it through a dirty rag before taking a single sip to wet their cracked throats. When February arrived, the loaf of bread was entirely gone, and the last tin of meat had been scraped so clean that the metal inside was bright. Their physical deterioration escalated rapidly. Their skin turned a sallow, translucent yellowish-gray color, their gums grew soft and began to bleed from the onset of scurvy, and their eyes sank deep into their skulls. They spent 20 hours a day lying completely motionless in their bunks, because even standing up caused their heads to spin violently and their knees to buckle under their weight. By the 3rd week of February, the crew had exhausted every single piece of organic material in the hold, including a small tube of mint toothpaste and a bar of laundry soap they found in a cleaning bucket. The hunger was no longer just a feeling, it was a physical weight that made it agony to move. Zygantian lay on the floor looking down at his feet, and his eyes locked onto his heavy military-issue boots. They were made of thick, vegetable-tanned cowhide leather, and he realized it was the only thing left on the boat that had once been alive. He took his pocket knife, his hand shaking so violently it took him 10 minutes just to slice through the heavy laces. He sat on the floorboards and began carefully prying the tiny metal eyelets and steel nails out of the leather panels. He cut the tongue of the boot into narrow, matchstick-sized strips. He gathered a few loose splinters of wood from an old cargo pallet, placed them inside a metal bucket, and lit a tiny fire, using the last few drops of lubricating oil from the engine block, creating a thick, black smoke. He placed the leather strips into a tin pot with a cup of the rusty pipe water and set it over the flame. The leather was incredibly tough, coated in layers of black boot polish, industrial wax, and sweat from months of military drills. They boiled the strips for hours, watching as a thick black scum floated to the surface of the water. They scooped the grease off with a piece of metal, boiling the hide over and over again until the leather fibers finally began to break down into a soft, jelly-like paste that smelled of chemicals. It tasted heavily of tar grease and processing oil, but the boys chewed the leather strips slowly, forcing the rubbery mass down their throats to give their stomachs something to compress. When the first boot was completely consumed, they moved on to the next one, sharing the portions equally. Over the next 10 days, they systematically disassembled their footwear, cutting up the leather linings, their uniform belts, and the heavy leather thongs they used to secure the equipment. Ivan Fedotov remembered that he had a small mouth harmonica stored in the pocket of his quilted winter jacket. He pulled it out, and the boys didn't care about the metal musical reeds. They focused entirely on the small leather strap attached to the casing. They pried the strap loose, scraped away the dirt with a pocket knife, and boiled it in the tin pot until it dissolved into a greasy black broth that they divided equally among the 4 of them, swallowing the bitter liquid to keep their organs from failing. By the first week of March, they had been drifting completely lost for over 45 days, and the ocean current had dragged the small steel barge over 1,000 miles southeast of the Kuril Islands, deep into the empty waters of the mid-Pacific. They had lost over 60 pounds each, and their muscles had wasted away to the point where they could no longer lift their limbs or stand up. They lay in the absolute darkness of the hold, drifting in and out of consciousness, struggling to draw breath. Zigantian found a loose metal nail on the wooden floorboards. He told the men that whoever managed to stay conscious the longest had a responsibility to use the nail to scratch all 4 of their full names into the steel wall of the hold, so that when the rusted shell of the T-36 was eventually found by a passing merchant ship, their families back in the Soviet Union would know exactly who had died inside the boat. They lay there in the silence, waiting for the dark to take them completely. On March 7th, 1960, which was the 49th day of their drift, Askat Zigantian was lying on his side when he felt a strange, low-frequency vibration humming through the steel hull. It wasn't the regular rolling motion of the ocean swells. It was a fast, rhythmic, heavy thumping sound coming from the air directly above the deck. He dragged his body toward the ladder, using his elbows to pull his weight up the rungs because his legs were completely useless, and pushed open the deck hatch with his shoulder. He blinked against the sudden brightness of the sky and looked up. Hovering just 50 feet above the rusted deck of the barge were 2 massive military helicopters with white star markings on their sides. Further out on the gray horizon sat the enormous, unmistakable silhouette of a naval aircraft carrier. It was the USS Kearsarge, a massive Essex-class vessel belonging to the United States Navy navigating through the deep blue water of the Central Pacific. The American pilots had been conducting routine anti-submarine radar sweeps across the sector when the watch officer spotted a tiny, anomalous metallic return on his screen hundreds of miles away from any known commercial shipping. Lands. They flew in to investigate, expecting to find an abandoned naval target or a piece of old wreckage, but as they looked through their cockpit glass, they saw a single emaciated man in a shredded Soviet uniform drag himself out of the deck, Hatch waving his hand weakly. The pilots immediately radioed the carrier, and the crew lowered heavy canvas rescue baskets down to the deck of the T-36. The American sailors pulled the 4 living skeletons out of the dark hold, carrying them up into the helicopters. The geopolitical landscape at that moment was incredibly volatile. It was the height of the Cold War. And these were active-duty Soviet soldiers being collected by their nation's primary ideological rival. But the naval crew paid no attention to politics as they lifted them aboard. They carried the 4 men directly into the carrier's sterile, warm medical bay. The ship's head surgeon knew that if they allowed the starving soldiers to eat a regular meal immediately, the sudden influx of solids would cause their shrunken, fragile digestive tracts to literally rupture, killing them within minutes. So the medical staff kept them confined to bed, administering nutrients through needles and giving them warm beef broth and fresh water in tiny thimblefuls once every hour, slowly nursing their organs back to functionality. The 4 soldiers had survived 49 days on the open sea, drifting over 1,020 miles away from their base. Once they were physically stable, they were transported to San Francisco, where they were given new clothes and treated with immense hospitality before being safely flown back to Moscow. They were universally celebrated across the Soviet Union as international icons of human endurance, and each man received the Order of the Red Star for maintaining strict military discipline under pressure. Askat Zigantian lived a long life, eventually returning to the water to work as a professional marine engineer in the docks of Leningrad, and he always kept a small, unpolished strip of cowhide leather sitting on his desk. A vast, trackless ocean can test the absolute limits of human flesh, turning a steel barge into a freezing concrete cell where men are forced to consume their own garments just to see another sunrise. But sometimes a box of isolation doesn't drift across the waves, and it isn't found by an aircraft carrier out in the wind. Sometimes the most dangerous locks are found right inside a quiet room on dry land where the keys are turned by a hand that everyone in the neighborhood has trusted for years. On the morning of August 21st, 1961, a senior security guard named Absolute Quiet walked through the high-arched stone corridors of the National Gallery in London, England. The air inside the Grand Museum was thick with the scent of old floor wax linseed oil and marble dust. It was just before 7:00 and the massive wooden entrance doors were still bolted shut from the inside, keeping the early morning fog from rolling into the exhibition halls. The guard followed his regular, predictable route, checking the iron latches on the display cases and making sure the thick velvet ropes were perfectly aligned. He walked into room 9, a prestigious gallery space with deep crimson walls that housed some of the most expensive artwork in the entire world. He shined his flashlight toward the center wall, expecting to see the stern, painted eyes of a British military hero staring back at him. But when the beam of light hit the fabric, the guard froze. The space between two large landscape paintings was completely bare. There was nothing left on the wall, but two empty iron hooks dangling from a wire and a dark rectangular shadow on the crimson wallpaper where a masterpiece had been hanging just hours before. Now, the painting that had vanished from that wall was Francisco Goya's famous portrait of the Duke of Wellington. And to understand why this discovery immediately caused a wave of absolute panic to rip through the entire British government, you have to look back just 19 days prior. In the summer of 1961, a wealthy American oil businessman named Charles Wrightsman had purchased the portrait at a private auction for a staggering sum of £14,000, with the intention of packing it into a wooden crate and shipping it across the Atlantic to his private estate in New York. The public was completely outraged by the idea of a national treasure leaving the country, so the British government stepped in, using a massive amount of public tax money and a large donation from a charity fund to buy the painting back from the American collector, ensuring it would stay inside the National Gallery forever. It was a massive point of national pride, and the portrait had been put on display with immense fanfare, attracting thousands of visitors who lined up around the block just to catch a glimpse of the red-coated general on the canvas. So within 30 minutes of the guard finding the empty wall, the building was completely swarmed by the top detectives from Scotland Yard's elite flying squad. They brought in forensic technicians who used small brushes to dust the iron hooks for fingerprints, and they launched a massive lockdown of the entire city. The investigators immediately brought in Interpol, locking down every airport, sealing the shipping ports along the Thames, and ordering border customs agents to tear open every trunk and cargo crate, leaving the country. The general consensus among the high-ranking officials at Scotland Yard was that they were dealing with a highly sophisticated international syndicate of art thieves. They figured a group of elite cat burglars had spent months mapping out the museum's layout, using specialized glass cutters and high-tech tools to bypass the state-of-the-art security systems before smuggling the canvas out to a waiting yacht in the harbor. But as the detectives dug deeper into the physical evidence, they ran into a series of details that completely defied their theories. First of all, the thieves had not touched any of the other multi-million-dollar paintings hanging in the exact same room, some of which were much smaller and far easier to carry out of the building. And more importantly, when the security experts examined the museum's primary alarm system, they discovered that the electronic sensors had not been compromised or cut at all. It looked like the intruder had simply walked right up to the wall, lifted the heavy gold-plated wooden frame off its mounts, and exited the building without triggering a single bell. The police launched a massive canvass of the neighborhood, interviewing every taxi driver and street sweeper who had been near Trafalgar Square during the night. But nobody had seen a delivery van or a group of men carrying a large rectangular object out of the gallery. Then, 10 days after the portrait vanished, the investigation took an incredibly bizarre turn. The editors at the Reuters news agency in London opened their morning mail and found an unstamped envelope containing a handwritten letter. The note was not written in the formal code language of a professional criminal organization. Instead, it was penned in simple, rough block letters on a cheap sheet of lined notebook paper. The authors stated clearly that they had the Duke of Wellington's safe in their possession, but they were not looking to sell it to a private collector on the black market for personal greed. The letter writer demanded that the British government set up a dedicated charity fund containing exactly £140, the exact amount of money that had been spent to buy the painting back from the American oil tycoon. The author insisted that this fund must be used to purchase public television licenses for poor pensioners and retired laborers who couldn't afford the £5 annual fee required by the state to watch the BBC at home. The note ended with a blunt warning stating that if the authorities refused the demand, the canvas would be completely destroyed. The detectives at Scotland Yard looked at the letter and immediately concluded that it had to be an elaborate smokescreen engineered by a master criminal to lead the bloodhounds in the wrong direction. They figured the international syndicate was using the bizarre demand for pensioners' television fees to mock the police and buy themselves enough time to arrange a secret shipment to a billionaire collector in South America, or Europe. The police experts analyzed the paper under ultraviolet lights, searching for watermarks or hidden chemical traces. and they ran the handwriting through every criminal database in the country, but they couldn't find a single match. Over the next 4 years, the case went completely cold. The public began to joke about the missing general. The museum directors faced intense scrutiny for their security lapses, and 3 more anonymous notes arrived at various newspapers, each one continuously mocking the detectives and providing specific details about the texture of Goya's paint to prove that the portrait was still intact. But in May of 1965, 4 full years after the heist, a clerk working at the left luggage registry inside the New Street railway station in Birmingham noticed a flat parcel wrapped in brown butcher paper sitting on a rear shelf. The package had been left there anonymously with a small ticket attached to the twine. The clerk pulled the paper back and his jaw dropped. Nuzzled inside the wrapping was the portrait of the Duke of Wellington, completely undamaged and rolled up tightly, though its heavy gold-plated wooden frame was completely missing. 6 days later, a portly 61-year-old out-of-work bus driver walked calmly through the front doors of the Scotland Yard headquarters in London. He walked up to the reception desk, took off his cloth cap, and told the desk sergeant that he was the person who had taken the painting from the National Gallery and he was ready to be locked up. The man's name was Kempton Bunton, and he looked like the absolute furthest thing from a James Bond-style supervillain that the police could possibly imagine. He had a round, friendly face, wore a threadbare wool jacket with patched elbows, and walked with a heavy, slow limp due to a severe case of chronic rheumatism. Kempton was a passionate, eccentric political activist from the working-class town of Newcastle who had spent years writing angry letters to local politicians, arguing that the state's annual television fee was a tannion tax on the elderly and the particle lonely. The detectives put him into an interrogation room, fully expecting to discover that he was a crazy person looking for attention, or a minor actor hired by the real international art thieves to take the fall. But Kempton sat quietly in the wooden chair, smiled at the officers, and began providing an incredibly specific step-by-step account of how he had entered the museum, detailed information that had never been shared with the public or the press. But there was a secret about this entire heist that stayed completely locked inside government files for over 50 years, a detail that the police didn't figure out until long after the case was closed. Kempton Bunton had not actually stolen the painting at all. The entire high-profile raid on the nation's most secure gallery had been pulled off by his 20-year-old son, John Bunton. John was a quiet, slender young man who had grown tired of listening to his father constant loud rants about the television tax and the Goya portrait, so he decided to take matters into his own hands to help his father win his political stake, crusade against the state. Based on the official trial transcripts from the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey and the eventually released files from the Director of Public Prosecutions, here is a reconstruction of what happened inside the National Gallery in Activdid, the early hours of August 21st, 1961. Around 5:50 a.m., a young man in dark, loose-fitting clothes walked down the narrow gravel alleyway that ran along the rear wall of the museum. The street was completely empty, with the morning fog keeping the local residents inside their brick row houses. As the young man scanned the stone masonry of the building, he noticed a large set of heavy wooden ladders left behind by a crew of bricklayers who had been repairing the roof drainage pipes over the weekend. He hoisted the ladder against the side of the stone structure, climbed slowly up to the second-floor level, and found himself standing on a narrow concrete ledge directly in front of a small window leading into a staff restroom. He pushed on the wooden frame, and to his surprise, the latch had been left entirely unfastened by the evening cleaning crew. He slid his slender body through the small opening, dropped onto the tiled floor of the restroom, and walked out into the main exhibition corridor. The young man didn't have any specialized wire cutters, and he wasn't carrying a glass suction cup. He simply walked through the high arched doorways until he reached room 9, completely unbothered by the state-of-the-art security sensors because the museum directors always ordered the electronic alarms to be turned completely off during the early morning hours so that the daily cleaning staff could sweep the marble floors and dust the frames without tripping the system. He walked straight up to the Goya portrait, reached up with his bare hands, lifted the heavy gold frame off its iron mounts, and carried it back down the corridor. He climbed out the restroom window, slid down the wooden ladder, and walked to the nearest public transit stop, sitting on the back seat of a public bus with a multi-million-dollar national treasure tucked loosely under his arm. before sliding it completely under his mattress in his small bedroom in Newcastle. When Kempton found out what his son had done, he was absolutely astonished, but he decided to use the stolen canvas to launch his grand political protest, keeping the painting hidden inside a dark wooden cupboard behind his bed for 4 years, while he composed the anonymous ransom notes to the Reuters news agency. But when the government continuously refused to set up the television fund, the pressure of keeping a famous masterpiece inside a working-class house grew too heavy, and Kempton decided to return the canvas and take the absolute entire blame for the crime to protect his son from going to prison. In November of 1965, the grand trial of Kempton Bunton opened inside the packed courtroom of the Old Bailey, attracting hundreds of spectators and international reporters who wanted to see the portly bus driver face justice for the blast. Heist of the century. The prosecution was entirely confident that they would secure a lengthy conviction for grand larceny, presenting Kempton's signed confession and the recovered canvas as absolute proof of a major criminal act. But Kempton's defense lawyer, an incredibly clever and sharp-witted barrister named Jeremy Hutchinson, looked closely at the ancient text of the British Larceny Act of 1916 and found a massive, unprecedented legal loophole. Hutchinson stood before the Boythorn Diwan and pointed out that under the strict wording of English common law at the time, to be found guilty of the crime of theft, the prosecution had to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the accused individual had a specific permanent intention to deprive the owner of their property forever. The defense lawyer argued that Kempton had never had any intention of keeping the Duke of Wellington or selling it for personal financial gain on the black market. He had simply borrowed the portrait as a temporary leverage tool to draw public attention to his political campaign for the elderly. And he had always fully intended to return the canvas to its rightful place on the gallery wall once his message had been clearly delivered to the politicians. The judges and the prosecutors were completely stunned by the argument, but the logic of the ancient legal statute was absolute. After a brief deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered a verdict that left the entire establishment at Scotland Yard in complete disbelief. Kempton Bunton was found not guilty of stealing Francisco Goya's portrait of the Duke of Wellington. The jury only convicted the bumbling father on a single minor secondary charge, the theft of the heavy, gold-plated wooden frame which Kempton admitted he had accidentally broken apart and discarded in the woods behind his house, meaning it could never be returned to the museum collection. Kempton was sentenced to exactly 3 months inside a regional prison for the loss of the frame, walking out of the gates a short time later to a crowd of cheering supporters. The British Parliament was so completely embarrassed by the outcome of the trial that they immediately drafted a new piece of legislation, passing the Theft Act of 1968, which explicitly made it a permanent criminal offense to remove any artwork from a public display without authorization, regardless of whether the individual intended to return it later. John Bunton eventually confessed his role in the actual removal of the painting to the authorities in 1969. But given his father's prior acquittal and the state's desire to close the bizarre chapter forever, the legal directors decided not to launch any further prosecutions against the family. The portrait of the Duke of Wellington was carried back into Room 9 of the National Gallery, where it was secured to the crimson wall with thick iron bolts and steel reinforcing rods, its stern painted eyes looking out over a new generation of visitors who walked past the frame in absolute silence. A heavy canvas can be lifted off its hooks through an open restroom window in less than 5 minutes, turning a massive international police hunt into a quiet secret hidden beneath a mattress for 4 long years. But sometimes, an unexpected encounter doesn't happen inside the high stone corridors of a city museum, and the strange sights aren't hidden behind a gilded frame. Sometimes, a regular patrol officer can turn his vehicle onto a dark, isolated road in the middle of a desert hoeing mac, entirely unaware that the strange, bright neon lure he sees rising over the brush is about to pull him into a mystery that the United States military will never be able to explain. On the afternoon of December 31st, 1962, 38-year-old Dr. Gilbert Bogle sat at his desk in a government laboratory in Sydney, Australia. He was, a highly respected physicist working on complex classified projects for the national defense sector. The air conditioning in the facility hummed loudly, combating the intense midsummer heat wave that had been baking the city for days. So Gilbert organized his handwritten notes and locked them inside a heavy metal filing cabinet. He checked his wristwatch, grabbed his suit jacket from the back of his chair, and walked out to his car. Gilbert was known among his academic peers not just for his intellect, but for his perfectly tailored clothes and active social calendar. And tonight was New Year's Eve, so he was expected at a large gathering hosted by a fellow scientist in the affluent suburb of Chatswood. He drove with the windows rolled down, listening to the radio and looking forward to a long night of drinking and conversation. Across town, 29-year-old Margaret Chandler was standing in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting a floral dress. She was the wife of Jeffrey Chandler, another prominent scientist who worked in the same elite circles as Gilbert. Margaret carefully applied her makeup while Jeffrey waited in the hallway. They had a complicated marriage, largely defined by long hours apart and an unspoken agreement to maintain a polished public image at social events. Now they left their house around 8. By the time Gilbert pulled up to the party, the street was already lined with vehicles. The house was a large brick building with a sprawling backyard, and the front door was propped wide open to let the evening breeze inside. He walked into the living room and found it packed with colleagues, their spouses, and various local academics. A wooden record player in the corner spun jazz records, but the music was kind of drowned out by the overlapping voices and the clinking of heavy glass tumblers. Gilbert fixed himself a drink at the makeshift bar on the kitchen counter, and as he turned around, he caught sight of Margaret Chandler standing near the sliding glass doors that led to the back patio. They had crossed paths at several functions over the past year. There was a mutual understanding between them built on fleeting eye contact and brief conversations by the punch bowl. So tonight, with the alcohol flowing and the loud noise of the party insulating them, Gilbert walked straight over to her. They stepped out onto the concrete patio, leaving the crowded living room behind. The night air was thick and humid. For the next several hours, Gilbert and Margaret stood near the edge of the manicured lawn, talking quietly. Jeffrey was inside the house, smoking cigarettes, with a group of men from the laboratory, occasionally glancing outside, but making no move to interrupt his wife. The conversation between Gilbert and Margaret shifted from polite small talk to much deeper personal territory. When midnight struck, the party erupted into loud cheers and applause. People embraced and raised their glasses to the ceiling. Gilbert and Margaret stood close together in the shadows of the yard, completely separated from the chaotic celebration indoors. The early hours of 1963 ticked by slowly. The crowd began to thin out around 2 in the morning as people called for taxis or stumbled to their cars. But Gilbert and Margaret remained in their secluded spot, finishing their drinks. By 4 in the morning, the house was mostly quiet. A few lingering guests were asleep on the couches. Jeffrey had reportedly left the party earlier to attend another gathering in a different suburb, leaving Margaret behind. So Gilbert leaned in and suggested they go for a drive. Margaret nodded, picking up her small handbag from a patio chair. They walked out the front door together, their footsteps echoing on the empty concrete sidewalk, and got into the passenger and driver seats of Gilbert's car. Gilbert started the engine and drove out of the suburbs. The sky was still pitch black, and the roads were entirely deserted. He steered the car toward the Lane Cove River, an area known for its dense eucalyptus trees and winding dirt paths. He turned off the paved main road, the tires crunching loudly over dry branches and loose gravel. He parked the car in a small clearing surrounded by thick, overgrown brush. They opened the heavy metal doors, stepped out into the humid air, and walked down a muddy slope. Several hours later, around 8 in the morning, the gray light of the new day filtered through the tree canopy. The Lane Cove River flowed slowly, its surface perfectly still. 2 teenage boys were walking along the muddy banks, carrying long sticks. They lived nearby and frequently came down to this specific stretch of the river to search for stray golf balls that players hid over the fence from a neighboring country club. The boys walked carefully, keeping their heads down, scanning the damp weeds. One of the boys stopped and pointed his stick at a shallow, sandy depression near the edge of the water. There was a large, heavy piece of old carpet and several flattened cardboard boxes laid out on the ground. The pieces of cardboard were arranged in a very deliberate overlapping pattern, completely covering something underneath. The edges of the cardboard were slightly dark from the morning dew, so the boys immediately assumed someone had stashed a pile of stolen goods or a cache of expensive golf clubs. The older boy stepped through the thick mud, reached down and grabbed the coarse edge of the carpet. He pulled it back fully, expecting to find a canvas bag or a metal box. But instead he saw a pale human arm resting in the dirt. He dropped the heavy fabric instantly. He yelled out to his friend and they both scrambled backward, their boots slipping and sliding on the steep mud embankment. They ran through the trees as fast as they could, pushing branches out of the way until they hit the paved road. They flagged down a passing commercial delivery truck. The driver slammed on his brakes, and the boys breathlessly explained what they had just seen by the water. The driver told them to jump in the back, and he sped directly to the local police precinct. Within 15 minutes, 4 uniformed officers arrived at the Lane Cove River. They navigated down the slope, holding onto roots and rocks for balance. They found the depression in the cardboard boxes exactly as the teenagers had described them. The senior officer put on thick gloves and slowly lifted the cardboard and the carpet. Underneath were the bodies of a man and a woman. They were partially undressed, lying completely still, side by side on the cold ground. The officers immediately secured the area, stringing rope between the trees to establish a perimeter. They radioed dispatch, requesting homicide detectives and a medical examiner. The initial assumption among the officers was that they were securing the scene of a violent double murder. But when the detectives arrived and began documenting the scene with their cameras and flashlights, the physical evidence made absolutely no sense. The mud around the bodies was perfectly smooth. There were no deep footprints indicating a struggle, no scuff marks from someone being dragged, and no broken twigs in the immediate vicinity. The bodies themselves were entirely clean. There was no blood on their skin or on the ground. Their remaining clothing was not torn, stretched, or soiled by a fight. The lead detective checked the pockets of a pair of men's trousers, discarded a few feet away. He pulled out a leather wallet and opened it. The identification cards clearly displayed the name Dr. Gilbert Bogle. Within a few hours, the police cross-referenced local reports and identified the woman beside him as Margaret Chandler. They contacted the host of the New Year's Eve party and confirmed the two had left the house together shortly before dawn. The identities were locked in, but the cause of death remained a total blank. The bodies were transported to the city morgue. The detective stood in the brightly lit autopsy suite, confident that the experienced medical examiner would find a hidden puncture wound or extensive internal bleeding. The doctor began his examination, meticulously checking the scalp, the eyes, and the back of the neck for any sign of blunt force trauma. He found nothing. He made the standard incisions and examined the internal organs. The heart, the liver, and the kidneys were all completely healthy. The doctor checked the airways, thinking perhaps the killer had held a soft pillow over their faces. But there were no petechial hemorrhages in their eyes, which would indicate suffocation, and no bruising on their lips or throats. He then examined the lungs to see if they had drowned in the nearby river and been dragged out. The lungs were completely dry and fully intact. The doctor removed his gloves, looked at the detectives, and stated that there was absolutely no structural cause of death. Without a physical injury, the investigation immediately pivoted to poison. The detectives ordered the laboratory to run an exhaustive, highly comprehensive toxicology panel. They demanded tests for cyanide, arsenic, heavy metals, strong barbiturates, and rare alkaloids. The lab technicians worked for weeks, extracting fluid samples, running them through centrifuges, and applying various chemical reagents. The detectives waited by their phones, certain that a lethal dose of a fast-acting toxin would be found. When the thick toxicology report was finally delivered to the police precinct, the lead investigator read through the pages in disbelief. The results were entirely clean. There were no illegal narcotics, no lethal doses of alcohol, and no trace amounts of any known poison in either of their systems. Gilbert and Margaret were in perfect health at the exact moment their hearts stopped beating. The complete lack of medical evidence forced the police to look aggressively at the people closest to the victims. Jeffrey Chandler was brought into the station for questioning. He sat in a small, windowless interrogation room while 2 detectives sat across from him. They pressed him hard, suggesting he had followed his wife and Gilbert from the party, driven his own car down to the Lane Cove River, and used an untraceable exotic method to execute them both. They watched his facial expressions and body language, looking for any sign of guilt or panic. Jeffrey sat calmly in his wooden chair, answering every question directly. Jeffrey provided a highly detailed timeline of his movements after leaving the party. He listed the exact times he arrived at a second, gathering the people he spoke to, and a late-night cafe he visited afterward. The detectives dispatched officers to verify his claims. Dozens of independent witnesses confirmed Jeffrey's presence at those locations during the crucial early morning hours. He physically could not have been at the river. With his alibi completely solid, the police had to clear him entirely. As the local police hit a brick wall, the story leaked to the press. The newspapers published front-page articles about the brilliant physicist and his lover found dead without a scratch. The public quickly developed their own theories. The most persistent and widely circulated idea was Cold War espionage. Gilbert worked in elite government defense circles. Speculation ran wild that foreign intelligence operatives had targeted him, luring him to the riverbank and using a highly classified nerve agent. The theory suggested that Margaret was either used as bait or simply killed because she was a witness. Federal intelligence agencies quietly reviewed Gilbert's security files. They audited his laboratory, accessed his communications, and his financial records. They found absolutely no evidence that he was handling stolen secrets, no unusual bank deposits, and no contact with known foreign agents. Despite the lack of proof, the spy theory became deeply entrenched in the public consciousness for decades. Years passed, and the Bogle-Chandler case was placed in cold storage. The physical evidence degraded the original. Detectives retired, and the mystery became a legendary piece of Australian true crime history. The baffling scene at the Lane Cove River defied all logic and medical science. It was perfectly frozen in time. The clean bodies, the neatly arranged cardboard, and the absolute absence of violence. Over 40 years went by without a single new lead or a viable suspect being named in the case. In 2006, a team of environmental scientists decided to review the massive police file. They were not looking for a human suspect. They were looking at the dirt. The team went back to the exact muddy location on the Lane Cove River. They brought heavy drilling equipment and extracted deep core samples of the soil and the riverbed. They also pulled historical zoning records and environmental impact reports for the entire region, dating back to the early 1950s and 60s. The scientists discovered that during that era, the Lane Cove River was subjected to severe, unregulated industrial pollution. Factories and chemical plants upstream routinely dumped raw, untreated waste directly into the water. This chemical runoff settled into the thick mud at the bottom of the river. When these industrial chemicals mixed with naturally decaying biological matter, it created large, highly concentrated pockets of hydrogen sulfide gas trapped under the heavy sediment of the riverbed. Hydrogen sulfide is an incredibly lethal substance. It attacks the central nervous system and halts cellular respiration, causing rapid unconsciousness and death. Crucially, the scientists noted that hydrogen sulfide is a very heavy gas. When it escapes the ground, it does not float up and dissipate into the sky. It stays low, sinking into physical depressions in the landscape. It also metabolizes very quickly in human tissue, making it nearly impossible to detect in a standard 1960s toxicology screen. Based on the modern environmental analysis, the original police photographs, and the detailed medical reports here is a reconstruction of what experts believe happened at the Lane Cove River in the early morning of January 1st, 1963. Gilbert and Margaret walked down the dark slope and laid out a blanket in the sandy depression near the edge of the water. They were isolated and quiet, completely unaware of the industrial waste trapped in the thick mud just a few feet away from them. As they rested on the ground, a large pocket of hydrogen sulfide gas ruptured beneath the surface of the water. Because the morning air was extremely still and humid, the heavy lethal gas did not blow away. It rolled directly off the river and poured straight into the shallow depression. The invisible cloud rapidly displaced all the breathable oxygen in that confined space. The gas hit their respiratory systems immediately, acting so fast that they did not even have the chance to sit up or process what was happening. Within seconds, Gilbert and Margaret lost consciousness. Their central nervous systems shut down and they passed away quietly on the damp ground. There was no struggle, no pain, and no noise. The heavy gas simply smothered them, then slowly dissipated into the surrounding brush as the sun began to rise. But that still left the lingering question of the carpet and the cardboard boxes. If the gas killed them instantly, who had carefully arranged the materials over their bodies before the teenagers arrived? Investigators believe that an unknown passerby, likely someone walking along the riverbank in the early dawn hours, stumbled upon the depression. They saw the two bodies lying in the dirt. Finding a prominent scientist and a woman in a compromising state, this passerby panicked. They knew they should contact the authorities, but they did not want to be questioned by the police or tied to a major public scandal. They made a rapid, highly irrational decision to simply hide the scene and walk away. This anonymous person quickly gathered discarded trash from the brush, finding an old piece of carpet and some flattened cardboard. They laid the materials over Gilbert and Margaret, completely covering them. Then the passerby hurried back up the muddy slope and disappeared down the paved road, leaving the bodies to be discovered hours later. The environmental findings officially closed the 43-year-old mystery. Dr. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler were asphyxiated by the river itself. They were killed by a naturally occurring eruption of toxic gas on January 1st, 1963. The muddy banks of the Lane Cove River held their final secret for decades, burying the truth under layers of soil and water. But while some lethal threats rise up silently from the earth beneath us, other dangers hide behind locked doors, waiting for the exact right moment to turn a familiar room into a trap. The resolution of the Lane Cove River mystery leaves us with a profound sense of unease. Unlike the typical narratives of malice and premeditation, there was no shadowy figure waiting in the darkness with a weapon. The killer was entirely formless, lacking intent or conscience. It is a chilling reminder that nature itself can become a weapon when humans carelessly disrupt its balance, striking without warning. What makes this tragedy so deeply haunting is the absolute invisibility of the threat. Gilbert and Margaret walked into that secluded depression seeking privacy, completely unaware that they were stepping into an environmental trap. There was no struggle, no moment of realization, and no chance to fight back. It strips away the illusion of control we desperately cling to, showing how quickly life can simply be extinguished. Beyond the mechanics of their deaths, the anonymous passerby reveals a deeply troubling facet of human nature. Confronted with a horrific discovery, their instinct was not to seek help. They chose to hide the grim reality. They prioritized personal convenience and the avoidance of a public scandal over basic human decency. This frantic attempt to cover the bodies with discarded cardboard and carpet speaks volumes about the oppressive social climate of the early 1960s. The fear of being associated with an illicit affair between two prominent figures was stronger than the moral obligation to report a tragedy. It illustrates how the intense pressure to maintain a spotless public image can warp a person's judgment in moments of crisis. The victims themselves were also casualties of this exact same societal pressure. Gilbert and Margaret were forced to seek out the muddy, mosquito-ridden banks of a polluted river just to have an honest conversation away from the judging eyes of their peers. Their pursuit of a momentary connection in a highly rigid society inadvertently led them directly into the path of an invisible, unfeeling environmental executioner. The public obsession with Cold War espionage perfectly demonstrates the fragility of collective belief. When faced with a mystery defying medical science, society refused to accept an accidental phenomenon. The human mind inherently craves a villain and a logical progression of events to make sense of unexplainable loss. The elaborate theories involving foreign operatives and classified nerve agents were not just sensational newspaper headlines. They were a psychological defense mechanism. It is far more comforting to believe in a sophisticated international assassination plot than to accept that two people can be randomly suffocated by a pocket of gas rising from the mud. A planned murder implies a world that still operates on rules. The actual truth is infinitely more terrifying than any espionage thriller. It forces us to confront the fact that danger does not always wear a human face or operate with a discernible motive. The universe can be entirely indifferent to our existence, our social status, and our carefully constructed lives. A brilliant physicist and a prominent socialite were erased in seconds by a silent chemical reaction in the dirt. This case also serves as a dark monument to the era of unchecked industrial expansion. The lethal gas was not a completely natural occurrence, but the direct result of unregulated pollution from chemical plants upstream. It is a stark example of how societal negligence and the reckless pursuit of progress can silently poison the earth beneath our feet, leaving deadly traps waiting for unsuspecting victims decades later. We walk through our daily lives assuming that the ground we step on and the air we breathe are inherently safe. The tragedy at the Lane Cove River shatters that fundamental assumption. It highlights the deeply unsettling reality that the consequences of environmental abuse do not just wash away with the river current. They accumulate, they fester in the darkness, and eventually, they demand an absolutely devastating toll. Yet there is a strange comfort to be found in the relentless progression of modern science. The original detectives and medical examiners were entirely baffled by the lack of physical trauma, severely limited by the forensic technology of their time. They did everything correctly, according to the strict investigative standards of 1963. But the truth remained stubbornly buried under decades of toxic sediment and the obvious limitations of contemporary chemical analysis. It took more than 40 years for human knowledge to catch up to the reality of the crime scene. The modern environmental scientists who finally cracked the case did not rely on eyewitness testimony or forced confessions. They relied on patience, geographical data, and advanced geological core sampling. It is a testament to the enduring power of scientific inquiry and the refusal to let a mystery fade into permanent obscurity. There is no traditional justice to be found here. No suspect was ever put in handcuffs, no courtroom drama ever unfolded, and no gavel was ever struck. The families of the victims were left to endure decades of whispers, rumors, and wild speculation about the secret lives of their loved ones. They had to navigate the grief of an unexplained loss while the public turned their personal tragedy into a piece of folklore. But while there may be no justice in the traditional sense, the eventual discovery of the truth provided a profound sense of closure. It cleared the names of those falsely suspected of murder and silenced the endless conspiracy theories. The scientific explanation restored dignity to Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler, proving they were not the victims of a sordid underworld plot, but merely the victims of terrible circumstance. The image of the abandoned bodies covered in discarded trash remains one of the most striking visuals in the annals of true crime. It is a portrait of human vulnerability and the intense isolation that can exist even in a densely populated city. They died side by side, yet entirely alone, hidden away from a world that would have judged them harshly in life and proceeded to misunderstand them completely in death. We often believe that secrets are safe in the dark, buried where no one else can find them. But the earth has a long memory. The riverbed held the secret of their deaths just as surely as it held the toxic waste of a careless society. Eventually, everything rises to the surface. The mud gives way, the water recedes, and the painful truth is laid bare in the cold morning light, waiting to be properly understood. As we look back on the events of that fateful New Year's Eve, we are reminded of the delicate thread upon which human existence hangs. A single breath of stagnant air was enough to erase two complex lives, filled with ambition, secrets, and desires. It teaches us to approach the unknown with a sense of humility, recognizing that we are navigating a world filled with forces far older and far more powerful than ourselves. The Lane Cove River continues to flow quietly, today its dark waters masking the history embedded in its muddy banks. The physical scars of the tragedy have long since washed away, but the philosophical questions it raised remain deeply relevant. It asks us to consider what we are willing to hide to protect our comfort, and what invisible poisons we might be leaving behind for the next generation to suddenly discover. The location itself adds a layer of profound tragic irony to the narrative. The riverbank was supposed to be a sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the suffocating noise and the superficial interactions of the holiday party. They sought out nature as a refuge from the complexities of their social reality. Yet this very sanctuary betrayed them, harboring a silent violence, far deadlier than any human malice they could have imagined. There is also a striking commentary on the illusion of class and privilege. Dr. Gilbert Bogle was a highly respected physicist, a man whose intellect placed him in the upper echelons of society and government circles. Margaret Chandler was a fixture in an affluent, polished community, but in the dark mud of the riverbank, their status offered absolutely no protection. Nature is the ultimate equalizer, indifferent to prestige. For the original investigators, the sheer lack of answers must have been a crushing psychological weight. Detectives are trained to find patterns, to read the physical language of violence, and to follow the logical progression of human behavior. When confronted with a scene that offered zero behavioral clues, their entire framework of reality was shattered. It is deeply unsettling when the rules of your profession simply vanish. This intense desperation perfectly explains the exhaustive, almost obsessive search for exotic poisons and the harsh interrogations of innocent spouses. The police were terrified of what an unsolvable case meant for public safety. If two people could be murdered in the open without a single trace of evidence, then no one in the city was truly safe. They needed a suspect desperately to restore a sense of order to the community. Consider the lasting trauma inflicted on Jeffrey Chandler and the other individuals who fell under the heavy shadow of suspicion. He lost his wife in a bizarre tragedy, only to find himself sitting in a windowless room defending his own innocence against relentless accusations. The societal hunger for a neat, human-centered resolution often results in the unjust persecution of those left behind to pick up the shattered pieces. The mainstream media's role in amplifying this bizarre mystery absolutely cannot be understated. The national newspapers quickly transformed a tragic environmental accident into an international thriller, eagerly feeding the public's insatiable appetite for political scandal and intrigue. This breathless reporting effectively stripped the victims of their humanity, turning real people into mere fictionalized characters in a serialized spy novel for the sake of mass entertainment. As the years turned into decades, the actual human beings at the center of the story were entirely forgotten, replaced by the legend of the Lane Cove River mystery. People remembered the cardboard boxes and the baffling lack of trauma, but they forgot the very real grief of the families. The narrative took on a life of its own, becoming a ghost story told to frighten teenagers rather than a historical record of a fatal accident. When the modern environmental scientists finally published their findings, it was a profound act of historical redemption. It was not just about solving a crime. It was about rescuing two reputations from the realm of pulp fiction. The scientific data provided a definitive, factual anchor to a story that had drifted aimlessly in the sea of public imagination for over 40 years, finally allowing the victims to truly rest. The ultimate resolution of the Bogle-Chandler case is a masterclass in intellectual humility. It forces us to admit that we do not always have the answers, and that our initial assumptions are frequently entirely wrong. It reminds us that the universe is complex, operating on chemical and biological mechanisms that we may not fully understand. Sometimes the most terrifying answer is simply that nobody was actually in control. Looking forward, the case stands as a grim historical warning about our relationship with the natural world. The industrial hubris of the mid-20th century created a biological time bomb. It forces us to look at our modern landscapes and wonder what unseen hazards we are currently creating through our own negligence. The Earth absorbs our mistakes, but it eventually reflects them back to us with devastating consequences. In the end, this story is a mirror reflecting the delicate, highly vulnerable nature of the human condition. We build cities, we establish complex social hierarchies, and we convince ourselves that we have conquered the wild elements. But we are still flesh and bone, entirely dependent on the exact right mixture of oxygen and atmospheric pressure. Our mastery over the physical world is nothing more than a comforting, fragile illusion. The silent deaths on the riverbank remain a haunting chapter in our collective history, a story where science finally defeated superstition. It leaves us with a quiet reverence for the unknown and a lingering sorrow for two lives extinguished by a breath of foul air. As we close the file on Gilbert and Margaret, we are left to walk our own paths, hopefully a little more aware of the invisible forces that silently shape our